Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today, both physically in the room and online. My name is James Barber. I'm spokesperson at the Delegation. Aside from welcoming you, just a couple of items of housekeeping. The first is, please do join in online with the hashtag EU-2016-US. And for those of you that need the Wi-Fi password, it is DEC Wi-Fi, just DEC-WIFI. Having got the housekeeping out the way, I would like to introduce our three opening remarks from the EU Ambassador to the US, Ambassador David O'Sullivan, as well as Ivan Doherty of the National Democratic Institute and Jan Surachak of the International Republican Institute. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, James, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you present in the room and apparently those of you watching us on live streaming, one of the miracles of modern technology, which always makes me a bit nervous when people tell me that something is being live streamed. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, which is the sort of third and final installment of a journey we began back in July when we decided, having the privilege as diplomatic presence here in Washington, to be able to watch this remarkable exercise of democracy, which is the American presidential and congressional elections. We held an event in Cleveland during the Republican convention. We held one in Philadelphia, and we always planned to arrive in D.C. With the results of the election behind us to meet to decide how we could take forward transatlantic relations with the new administration and the new Congress. So I'm really very pleased to have this final piece of our puzzle for election 2016. I'd like to thank very warmly everyone who has agreed to speak, the moderators and the participants. I'd like to pay a special word of tribute to Senator Shaheen for being present here today. We know what a busy time it is. We're also very grateful Senator Johnson will join us later. We know what a very busy week it is in Congress, so we're delighted. And Senator Shaheen has always been a great friend of the EU delegation and Europe, so we're delighted she could make it. We hope that you will find this a useful meeting. We are very grateful, as ever, to the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute for the excellent cooperation they've given us throughout this process. They do fantastic work, not just here in the United States, but also more widely, and we're delighted to be able to partner with them. And of course, I should say a special word of thanks to the European Parliament Liaison Office to Congress, EPLO, who we co-host in the European delegation, and we're delighted to have here. So with those few words of introduction, I would just like to turn over the floor to Ivan Doherty from the National Democratic Institute and to Jan Surachak from the International Republican Institute. I think you're going first, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Excellence, ladies and gentlemen. We were advised earlier that the 20-minute speech was not appropriate, so just a few brief remarks. On behalf of the National Democratic Institute, we've always enjoyed a wonderful working relationship with the delegation here. We were particularly pleased to be involved with the event in Philadelphia in July at the convention. NDI, over the years, hosts 300 to 400 international leaders from around the world at the International Leaders Forum. And we were also very pleased to host High Representative Mrs. Mogherini in Philadelphia. Transatlantic relations, of course, is very important. From my accent, you'll understand why I have a specific interest, but so also does our chair, Secretary Albright, for the same reasons. So we hope that you have good discussions today, and I look forward to participating. Thank you very much. You're all very welcome.
Morning, everyone. On behalf of Mark Green, the president of the International Republican Institute, I'd like to begin with just a couple of notes of thanks to Ambassador O'Sullivan and his excellent team at the delegation, to Antoine Ripoll and his team at the European Parliament Liaison Office, and to my good friend Ivan Doherty and our colleagues at our sister organization, NDI, the National Democratic Institute, for all the hard work that everybody has put in to make all three events in this series, has been said, first at the RNC in Cleveland, then at the DNC in Philadelphia, and now today in Washington, a success. It comes as no surprise to anyone in this room that many Europeans have been coming to Washington in the weeks since November 8th to find out exactly what is going on in America. At IRI alone, over the past week and a half, we've had conversations with members of member state parliaments, or the European Parliament from Belgium, Spain, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the United Kingdom, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, and others of which I am completely unaware. And the message they've heard from speaker after speaker in our programs, in particular, but not only on Capitol Hill, is this. While there are still many things that are unknown about the incoming administration and how it will look and about the policy directions it will take, the Transatlantic Alliance remains the single most important strategic and trading relationship for the United States and the world today, and that does not change because one party or another holds the White House or controls the Congress. But in times of turbulence both in Europe and in America, it's incumbent upon all of us who are committed to this relationship to remain vocal advocates for it. To help move the European-American agenda forward, all of us need to raise a calm but firm voice in Brussels and in member state capitals, but also here in Washington, communicating with the United States Congress and with the incoming administration as it takes shape to say that the U.S.-EU partnership has been, is, and must remain the single most important global force for good. This is why we're grateful to the delegation for having proposed this series in the first place, and why we've been pleased to work together with them on it. We at IRI look forward to today's discussions and to working together even more closely with the delegation and with EPLO and with all of you in the coming years. Thanks.
A very quick further housekeeping point. I got the hashtag the wrong way round. It's US 2016 EU. You'll see that on your pens and on your information packs. Jeanne, thank you very much for those words of introduction, and Ivan and Ambassador O'Sullivan. It's now time for our first panel on EU-US cooperation in foreign policy. This panel is moderated by Hrda Conley, Senior Vice President at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and Director of their Europe Programme. Hrda.
Well, good morning. I will welcome our panelists forward, and perhaps Senator Shaheen, you can just remain at the podium because we're going to call on you first. Okay. Thank you so much. I am absolutely delighted to be able to our first panelist, who, as I like to say, there's nothing more precious than we can give than our time. And Senator Shaheen is giving us her very valuable time, but it is precious and short. So we're going to ask her to begin. Let me just say, in a moment of uncertainty, of which there is in any presidential transition, we look to our friends and our colleagues, our stalwarts of the transatlantic community, to help us navigate through these uncertain waters. And we could not have been more grateful and thankful that Senator Jeanne Shaheen could be with us this morning. Senator and Governor Shaheen makes history every single day by being the only woman to serve as both a governor and a U.S. senator. Since arriving in the Senate in 2009, she has served on prestigious committees, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee, Small Business Community. But I have to say, our favorite assignment, Senator Shaheen, was when you served as the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Europe. We so appreciate your stalwart support of this relationship, and we look forward to hearing from you and how we can navigate these uncertain foreign policy waters. Please.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you to all of the sponsors, and congratulations to all of you who beat the DC traffic and actually got here on time. We very much appreciate that. And I also want to thank this panel and the sponsors for accommodating my schedule. As you know, this is the last week we assume this is the last week that Congress will be in session. You never know. And so I apologize that I will throw out my remarks and then leave and miss the rest of the discussion and the opportunity for all of you to second guess and question what I had to say. This is a very broad topic this morning, and so I'm not going to try and address the range of things that are encompassed by the topic. But I wanted to give you 3 points that I think are important to this discussion as we think about how do we ensure continued cooperation and cohesion within the Transatlantic Alliance? How do we avoid division and disruption, which I think we have been seeing too much of in the last few years. And so my first point is, I think the new administration and Congress needs to determine what level of engagement we're going to continue to have in the world, but also in terms of Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance. And I think sometimes over the last administration, there has been a question about our commitment to some of our previous partnerships and to address disruption in other parts of the world. I think that was culminated for me by what happened in Syria when we drew a red line and then didn't do anything about it. And that sent mixed signals to both our allies and our adversaries in a way that I think produced some unintended consequences. So that, unfortunately, that ambivalence, I think, has been heightened during the campaign by some of the statements that were made by President-elect Trump with respect to NATO, with respect to support for our allies, with respect to defending some of our historic allies like Japan. And I think that some of those statements have been walked back since then, but we've seen some other statements since the election that I think have also contributed to the ambivalence. The one that I picked up this morning on the news was the statement about, needing to withdraw our intervention in the Middle East, but at the same time fight ISIL, and we're going to remember who helps us in that fight and who doesn't. Well, all of us here know that we're in that fight because it's in our interest to address terrorism throughout the world. And it's important for us to have allies who work with us on that, but it's important for us to do that regardless of what some of our allies have done. So I think that kind of ambivalence continues to send messages that are not helpful as we think about how do we continue to promote the Transatlantic Alliance, the Western values that the alliance stands for. And I would just add trade deals as a big piece of that, because as we all know, one of the ways that we're able to extend our influence, to work with other countries, to build that cooperative relationship is through trade. It's important to my home state of New Hampshire. I've been a big proponent of trade because we've seen jobs created, we've seen the importance of being able to export our goods and services and engage with our partners. It seems that TPP and TTIP are dead at this point. Whether there are pieces of that will be resurrected or not is not clear. But it's important not just because of the commercial aspect of those trade deals, again, as everyone here knows, but because of the strategic importance. That's another way for us to use soft power in a way that unites us, and as I think Jeanne said, the U.S.-EU commercial relationship is the biggest in the world, and TTIP would have been a way for us to solidify that commercial relationship. So very important as the new Congress comes in, as the new administration comes in, to think about how we can be more consistent in supporting the Transatlantic Alliance. And some of that ambivalence that I think many people have as they look at our actions has been fed by sequestration. I always believe that if you want to know what the policies are, follow the money. And what we've seen in the last several years has been that there has been no consistency about how we have funded our government. And that's sent, again, mixed messages to the rest of the world and to Europe. Sequestration has been a critical piece of that, and that's going to come back with a vengeance if we don't do anything to address it. Next year, I was at a meeting last week with some representatives from the Navy who said that they are now facing their 9th year of sequestration, of not being able to depend on a consistent budgeting process. And so they've instructed people not to plan for anything in the first quarter of the year. So imagine, we've got China, we've got Russia doing tremendous military buildups, and we've got a military that can't count on funding in the first quarter of each year. So that's a huge challenge that we've got to address, and we're facing now yet another continuing resolution. We know to fund the government through April, and now we're hearing that that will continue through the rest of the year, and that the new administration may not even offer a budget. Well, that sends a very mixed message. And when we have the president-elect before the troops in North Carolina yesterday saying, I'm going to make sure that you get everything that you need, and on the other hand, we have a budgeting process that says we're going to keep funding at the same levels. That is not a consistent message. That does not allow us to do what we need to do to address the needs of this country. And it's true for not just our own military needs, but as we think about how do we reassure our partners. The European Reassurance Initiative we just saw in the continuing resolution is funded at the levels that we had hoped, so hopefully that sends a positive message to the Baltics, to some of our Eastern European partners. But things like USAID programs in the Balkans, another potential hotspot where we know we're facing challenges. That continues at the same levels. Our support for refugee programs, one of the issues that's disrupting Europe now. We don't have flexibility because of the continuing resolution to continue to help in so many areas that are a challenge as we think about what we need to do in the next year. And the third point I would make is, and we had a panel before the Armed Services Committee yesterday where we talked a little bit about this, about the strategy that Russia is using to disrupt elections. Now, for the first time in my lifetime, we heard that Russians were disrupting the elections in the United States. And we've had top officials in government acknowledge that. We don't have all of the details because they've been classified. But we know that part of the intent was not to change the outcome, although it's still not clear about that. But the intent was to sow confusion and to raise questions about whether democracy was really the institution that we can believe in. And now we're seeing it in Germany. We've seen their intelligence officials suggest that this is going to be an issue in their elections. We've seen it, of course, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in so many of the Eastern European countries, in Italy. So I think the important thing is that, you know, as we think about how do we address our adversaries, we think about diplomatic measures, we think about military measures, but we haven't thought about disruption of democratic elections so much as a strategy. Well, this is clearly a strategy that the Russian government is engaging in, and we need to think about how we respond to that. So just as they're investing literally billions of dollars in Russian TV, in their messaging to Europe and to other parts of the world, they're also engaging in disrupting our democratic elections in a way that clearly has implications for the future. And one of the things that I think is imperative for us in Congress to do is to have hearings on what happened here and to try and look at ways that we can hold Russia accountable for their actions. But this is an issue not just for us, it's an issue for Europe and for the Transatlantic Alliance as we think about how we protect our democratic values. So 3 points that I think we ought to be thinking about as we look at the upcoming year. I'm sorry that I will miss the panel discussion because I'm sure it will be fascinating and you'll get into a lot more detail on these and so many other issues. But thank you all very much again for your being here and to the sponsors for holding a very important discussion about how we go forward.
Well, Again, as you walk out the door, Senator Shaheen, thank you so much. You've given our panel discussion an enormous amount of food for thought. And without further ado, let me turn to welcoming and introducing our panelist for this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Ambassador Hrda, who is Managing Director of Americas at the European External Action Service. Ambassador Hrda is responsible for us and many, many other countries, a significant responsibility. Ambassador Hrda is a senior Czech diplomat that has served as the Czech permanent representative to the United Nations and has also held very senior level positions in the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we're absolutely delighted to hear from a senior official at the External Action Service. After the ambassador concludes her opening remarks, we're going to quickly turn to Dean Joel Hellman, who is Dean of the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Hellman brings an enormous amount of experience, both from research as practitioner, having served 15 years at the World Bank in a variety of senior positions, including chief institutional economist, as well as director of the Center on Conflict, Security, and Development in Nairobi, Kenya. He's also served a stint in Europe as senior political counselor at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and we're delighted that Dr. Hellman can join us. And finally, last but not least, Ambassador Kurt Volker, who is the Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership, which is a part of Arizona State University, which is based, the institute is based here in Washington. Ambassador Volker is a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins SIS and a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with a colleague, and Kurt, we're delighted to have you here. So as moderator, let me get out of the way and allow our panelists to begin. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. Of course, as we have heard in the introduction remarks, many Europeans are now coming to the United States and are asking what is happening, what will happen. So I am here maybe to say that looking to Europe, there are also things happening, but it's still European Union. We are there and we have our policies and we have our priorities, which are many times very close to priorities and intention which United States had in the past and we hope will have also in the future, because our democracies, our shared values give us great opportunities to work together. It had been in the past and it will be definitely also in the future, being whatever administration under power and, as we have heard also, whomever in the Hill. So my role here is a bit to wrap up what we were doing, what we are doing, to show European Union priorities, and to express our hopes that there will be something where we could share, and what we could share with the United States also now in the next months and years. Of course, there are very few other partners in the world that share the norms and values as European Union and United States. And of course, if I can say it like this, we need to promote our trademark, the standards of democracy, free market economy, and human rights. And I think it's a vital and very important. Of course, European Union possesses a very broad spectrum of tools and capabilities, is unmatched by other partners of the US, and as Federica Mogherini said recently, Europe can be and is already a superpower. We represent the power of union. 500 million citizens. We are the biggest economy in the world among them, and we are one of the first global investors. Anywhere in the world you look, there is European Union. We are one of the first providers of humanitarian aid and development assistance, and I am now speaking about more or less 58.2 billion in 2014. and we are one of the first trade partners basically anywhere in the world as European Union. The EU runs now a network on 139 embassies, delegations worldwide, which complements and hundreds of missions of our member states and maintains really good rate of diplomatic service. And of course, now in the last year, you could hear something about the future and global strategy. It was adopted this year, and we are very much working on this global strategy, and it's something what I will then speak later on more in the detail. When I look to our cooperation in foreign policies, of course, what is for Europe very important is southern neighborhood. And close EU-U.S. cooperation is very much needed to vanquish Daesh and to return peace to Syria and in the region. As the fighting goes on in Syria, we are very much confronted, of course, with increased risks of that country breaking up into very little mini-states, which will only strengthen terrorism and radicalism in the country. And peace in Syria can only be agreed, we think, and we are absolutely sure about it, by Syrians and the UN framework mediated by Special Envoy. You can help in creating the conditions for that to happen, and we hope that we can work together with the United States and with the key regional partners. As a member of the global coalition against Daesh, EU will continue to bring value non-military resources to addressing the humanitarian dimension of the crisis, strategic communication, information sharing, and mine clearance. 15 of our member states contribute militarily. We have to think ahead already what we can do together to help stabilize for the long haul the areas liberated from Daesh. I think it's crucial and very important. Security sector reform, inclusive, non-sectarian governance come to mind. This can create a positive perspective for the time when a peaceful solution will be envisaged. Let us not forget as well that once Daesh is reigned, the problems in the region will not cease. The European Union looks forward to the new administration's engagement in the Middle East peace process, and we need to work together also as members of the quartet. We will need to prevent terrorism from creeping into Libya, preserve that country, fragile government of national unity as well as the integrity of the country. EU is doing a lot, provided already now resources to the flooding authority, and lately we have started to train the Libyan Coast Guards. Another very important part of the regional security equation is the deal with Iran. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a success story of transatlantic cooperation. And we have prevented war, furthered our non-proliferation objectives, not least by introducing verification measures and restricted Iran breakout time. And it's confirmed now by 4 IAES reports that Iran is sticking to the deal. It will be essential here to preserve transatlantic unity in the next stages of implementation. And Middle East will not be better off if Iran resumes nuclear enrichment, that's absolutely sure. There may be a nuclear arms race, and the possibility of direct conflict would increase dramatically with heavy consequences for global stability and economy. In future, European Union and United States will hopefully work closely, calibrate our policies vis-à-vis Iran between engagement that offers incentive for compliance with the Iran deal and containment pushback in the face of actions that are detrimental of our interest. Close EU-U.S. cooperation will be necessary in the EU's eastern neighborhood also. Russia, and Senator spoke already about it, the assertive behavior, increased military posturing, and attempts to influence our neighbors and Western political processes are unlikely to cease. And I see desirably of continued EU-U.S. commitment along 4 tracks, if I may. Fine-tuning of policy vis-à-vis Russia in general will be important, coordinating our positions on restrictive measures, supporting diplomatic efforts to find a lasting political solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and of course, and this is very important, and the European Union is very much aware, it's supporting as well as combating corruption and shoring up Ukraine's energy security. That is something what will be important and vital, and there should be no change in policy as concerned the non-recognition of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Other priorities for European Union are we need to stay engaged multilaterally to ensure international peace. EU and our member states cover nearly 40% of the UN peacekeeping costs and provide about half of all voluntary contributions to UN funds and programs. And UN has been very helpful to mobilize action on some of the items strong interested both for European Union and United States. Of course, other important topic, counterterrorism and migration. As Daesh faces defeat in the region, intelligence agencies expect it to metamorphose into cells targeting our societies. And we can already showcase deliverables from cooperation in counterterrorism with the United States. Europol has supported about 500 cases per year, including 50 high-impact operations. I think it's very important to follow up in that. European Union and US have strengthening direct ties in security and defense field. Of course, this is also expected to be a key item of the future transatlantic agenda for us. Yesterday, the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement was signed in Brussels, and this is a very important tool. It's burden sharing, intelligence sharing, and it was very vital idea for the cooperation. And we have not to forget trade. Trade is also an integral part of our lives, and energy security, very important topic for our cooperation. We are very much working even in this transition period in the areas of research and technology. EU has opened up new opportunities for US researchers to cooperate with the EU Horizon 2020 project, the biggest EU research project ever. And coming back to the trade, investment, and economic cooperation, our opinion is that the economic times, business and investment had been here before TTIP and will be here in the future also. And we have only to say that about 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic depend on transatlantic trade. And that's, I think, very important for the future of our mutual collaboration across the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, so much. Dr. Hellman.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be here. I'll be very brief. I just want to lay some issues out on the table for our further discussion. First of all, I'm very pleased to be dean of a school that was created nearly 100 years ago, right immediately after World War I, that was really designed and created around strengthening the transatlantic relationship, building alliances, strengthening trade, encouraging partnership in culture encouraging cross-cultural understanding with the missions for which the school was created. When the school was created in 1919, in fact, in the very day it was launched, the launching speech, the inaugural sort of speech of the dean at the time, talked about the school being created at a most extraordinary moment in the global world order. I do think today, nearly 100 years later, we are also at a most extraordinary moment in the world order. Madam Hrda has listed a set of priorities, a long list of a set of priorities that are kind of critical in the European-U.S. relationship. I'd go take that even one step further and say that we are at a moment in which some fundamental tenets, critical institutions, and relationships that essentially undergirded the post-war order are facing severe risks and tensions. Risks and tensions that are sort of so significant and they sort of threaten the very nature, the very basis of stability in that post-war era. And the priorities that Madam Hrda laid out, I think indeed are, I think, critical to that. Russia and its reemergence as a critical regional power, 4 simultaneous civil wars in the Middle East that are having tremendous after effects across the entire globe. The essentially move away from active conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq and the implications for that for stability in those two critical countries. Obviously, European integration and the impacts of domestic politics across Europe that will impact the nature and shape of European integration to come. China, the issues one can list are numerous. They are fundamental drivers of stability or the lack of stability, and they are fundamental aspects of the post-war order. At the moment, it is very difficult to say what the implications of this election are for that whole range of absolutely critical issues. But I think what we can see already, and I think what's valuable to keep doing in these kinds of fora and others as more and more information comes through, is to start to see where the biases are moving and how to respond to those biases. Because working, engaging, responding to these critical issues is going to be absolutely sort of essential as we rethink the post-war order. And I see 3 biases that are developing beyond the electoral rhetoric, so as the transition plays itself out, that I think are really critical for us to think about, to recognize, to name, to discuss. The first bias is a bias towards a reactive approach as opposed to a strategic approach. So if we are, as I contend, in an era in which some of the basic and most fundamental aspects of security in the post-war era are facing severe risks and strains, some critical relationships are facing severe risks and strains, we have never been in an era where strategy, thinking strategically, thinking globally about how we want to respond, shift, and reshape the post-war order has never been more important. And yet, we do see the beginnings of administration that is likely to be far more reactive than strategic. Now, why do I say that? Obviously, diplomacy by Twitter sort of gives one a hint at that approach, but I use that really more as a metaphor rather than an actual, that actual shift in policy. What concerns me much more is less the Twitter diplomacy and something that we're already starting to see from a vantage point of a school in Washington that has traditionally been a critical reservoir of support across administrations, Republican and Democrat, for strategic input into foreign policy making. And that is something that we already can see some very clear trends. There is a deep wellspring of foreign policy expertise, strategic thinking in the Republican Party that has experience governing in administrations, deep strategic thinking in the range of think tanks, the range of universities that have generated, I think, a very powerful cadre of strategic thinkers. As we see the transition move forward, it seems very clear that that generation of strategic thinkers is likely to be passed over in the formation of this administration. So as we look to think about not who is going to fulfill the posts of secretaries, ministerial level posts, but we look at the deputies, the assistant secretaries, the heads of departments. It's there that we see the draining of the approach towards sort of strategic thinking. So the group of Republican strategists that have sort of signed the statement during the election that they are unlikely to work for the Trump administration going forward, that group is, I think, retaining coherence. I don't think it's losing members being picked off into the administration. That group is unlikely to work in the new administration. I, as a dean, have always depended upon a flow of people in and out of the administration just to manage my office space, if nothing else. We have people coming in from the Democratic administration as they leave. We have people going out from the Republican administration as they take new positions. I can tell you that I've got a big office space problem because I've got a lot of people coming in from the Obama administration and a lot of the traditional people who work on Asia, who work on the Middle East, who work on Europe, who would be filling deputy and assistant secretary roles, who will be bringing strategic depth and coordination, relationships and a network of relationships in those regions. They are not considering posts in the new administration. And that's not just at Georgetown, but though Georgetown has, to some extent, a privileged relationship by dint of our history and our location. But I see this across the spectrum. And I think that concerns me. Without that strategic depth that the Republican Party has built up over a generation, if not longer, one can only see the likelihood of a more reactive approach to the problems that we're facing and a less strategic rethinking of some of the fundamental risks that we see coming up in our post-war order. The second bias is a bias towards unilateralism versus multilateralism. Again, I think we see that in the beginnings of the appointment. I think we see that in almost all of the rhetoric and approach to problems that we've sort of seen so far, so that when we face critical problems that were listed here that are really creating significant threats to some of the basis of stability in the post-war era, I think we're going to see a bias towards unilateral approaches rather than multilateral approaches. And I think that has deep concerns. And finally, although this is the weakest in terms of evidence and approach, I worry about a bias towards the use of force versus the use of diplomacy. And this, of course, is playing itself out in the role of military and ex-military officers in key positions overseeing the military, overseeing and enabling civilian control over the military. I think these three approaches, a bias towards reaction versus strategic approaches, strategic thinking, a bias towards unilateral versus multilateral, and a bias towards force versus diplomacy, means that as we face these very sort of significant risks to the fundamental sources of stability in the post-war order, the filters by which those risks are going to be reacted to come through these biases. And I think these are the deepest concerns that I have. So we can list many issues that need to be at the front and center of policymaking. We don't know where this administration is likely to come out on any of those particular issues because we don't really have a roadmap to the thinking that underlies this administration in terms of the individuals, in terms of the ideology, in terms of the approach. But these biases we can already see, and these biases will shape the way they respond to these issues in a way that I think is deeply troubling and one in which we have to pay sort of significant attention to as they develop their responses to these problems. So I'll leave it at there. I think there's already enough for us to kind of discuss and worry about. But I think that's as far as we can go to in seeing these biases at this stage.
Dr. Hellman, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. Look forward to the questioning period. Ambassador Volker.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Thanks, Heather. Thanks to my colleagues here on the panel. I'll offer a few thoughts in a few different directions, kind of for discussion, as Dean Hellman just did. First off, let me apologize for my voice as well, too. It's been terrible for a week. The first thing is we are 4 weeks from an election. No one has taken office. No policies have changed. So all of this is a lot of speculation about things we really don't know much about. So the first thing I would say is let's not make any assumptions. We saw a campaign where if you were to extrapolate what President-elect Trump said during the campaign, then you'd have a lot of worries about, well, what about this, what about that? But we have no idea, given that that campaign seemed to be run mostly to appeal to people's emotions about their frustration with government, what the new government actually will be doing. And I would say, if anything, some of the personnel choices and signaling we've gotten has been more encouraging rather than discouraging over the last 4 weeks. But I wouldn't read too much into that either. I'd say let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. And in fact, a lot of colleagues from Europe have been passing through over those few weeks, and that's been my general counsel to people. Don't make any assumptions. Don't lecture. Do your own homework. Know yourselves and what you can bring to the table, and be a problem solver. Let's focus on what the problems actually are and how we can actually solve those problems. And this is where I think it's very interesting, the juxtaposition of the different commentaries we've had so far this morning from Senator Shaheen, from our colleague Madam Hrda from the EU, from Dean Hellman. We have a survey of strategic challenges from an American perspective and a U.S. Senator's perspective, which frankly could have been delivered by a Republican or a Democrat on the Hill. Wouldn't matter. It would be pretty much the same. From the EU, again, a survey of these strategic challenges. And then Dean Hellman kind of looking into what a Trump administration might be. But I would take a step back from that, and I would say that the problems here, many of the ones that Dean Hellman described, I would say apply also to the Obama administration. Many of the fears Europe has right now about what a Trump administration might do are based not only on what he said, but also the experience of the last 8 years where we've seen some of that already. And a key thing is to realize what the issues are. I think the most important challenge to the transatlantic community, the single most important threat that we face is us, ourselves. That we have governments, including in this country and including in many countries in Europe, that our publics do not have confidence in. They seem to be reactive, as the dean said. They seem to be paralyzed by the trade-offs and not doing anything. They seem to be so geared towards structure and process that one is left wondering, but what is the point and what's the outcome? They seem to be so aimed at protecting minorities that majorities are worried about what's happening to us, what's happening to our rights, our identity, who is protecting what's normal. And that's why I think you see this backlash against governments, whether it's the Renzi vote or the Brexit vote or the rise in the polling of the Allianz for Deutschland. Why did Angela Merkel have to come out and say a year before the election that she is standing again? Why did Fillon, come out and then in a month overtake everybody in the polls? Because there's just such frustration about everything else going on. And that frustration manifested here in the rise of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party in the primaries and the success of Donald Trump in both the primaries and the general election. So that's I think, a big problem. And let's play that out. So people feel that, like, for instance, immigration, big issue that was mentioned here. No one in Europe or the U.S. feels like our government has its arms around immigration. That people are coming into Europe by the tens of thousands with nobody knowing who they are. And then very hard to deal with where they are and what to do about them. And this has caused a large part of the backlash. It's remarkable to me, for someone who spent a lot of time in Scandinavia, to see that after having built this wonderful bridge between Sweden and Denmark, you now have border guards on both sides of the bridge, which has then completely disrupted that mega economy around Copenhagen and Malmö, which had grown up. So these are the sorts of things that people who are trying to get to work in the morning and now face a couple-hour delay, they just don't feel like governments have their arms around this. And you could play the same thing out here. You can label it as elites. You can label it as the governing elite, the people who the dean is hiring and doesn't have enough office space for. You could label it as them. You could label it as populism versus the elites, or you could label it as, genuinely sincere, educated, intelligent, talented, problem-solving people, but ones in whom publics have lost confidence because they don't see that things are going forward. This gets to a question then, I think we have to really get down to fundamentals. I did have a great opportunity once to interview a very, very senior U.S. statesman. I won't say his name publicly, but I said, what is the single most important piece of advice you would give a new statesman, a young statesman coming up in foreign policy? And it was, know yourself. Know who you are, your values, know what your capabilities are. And then based on that, you can make decisions about what to do in the world. And I think that's kind of what we have to do now. We have to know ourselves in terms of our values. And I think there has been a irrational retreat from traditional democratic values because the people elected through those processes haven't delivered. I think it's incumbent upon us who are committed to these core democratic values to fight for them, but also to fight for solutions to problems and not be satisfied with process that leaves gridlock. The second one is to set clear goals. We need to know what it is we're trying to do. Sometimes with the political debate, particularly in Europe, I'll put a little bit onto the EU here. So, are we trying to protect Europe? Are we trying to build a more integrated Europe? Are we trying to create a defense community? Are we trying to deal with immigration? But then you get to all the challenges of, well, if you want to deal with immigration, what do you do about the sources of refugees and the sources of migration? And if you're going to deal with security, what are you going to do about the sources of challenge to that security, such as Russia? And then the goals get very, very murky. And so I think it is very important to establish some clear goals based on what we are as societies and what we want to achieve. Third, I think it's very important that as we do that, we match means to ends. We often do a great job of talking about what we wish for, but not willing to put the resources in to actually make it happen. And so I think there's a big mismatch in our wish list and our resources. So making sure that we keep them in alignment. If we have to spend more on defense, spend it. If we aren't willing to do it, let's look at what we say those goals are and where we can draw lines that we can stand by. If it's immigration, yes, we want to restrict immigration, but are we really willing to do what it takes to then make it stop? Not enough just to resettle and then create the conditions where more want to come. So I think getting those resources in line with goals is critical. And finally, and the Dean mentioned this too, we can only do these things successfully if we do them as part of a larger community. I think this point about unilateralism versus multinationality is true across the board. We can't deal with Russia alone. We can't deal with migration issues alone. We can't solve Syria alone. We can't solve Libya alone. Now, often what has happened is, I'd say in the Bush administration we had a sense of, we're going to solve this and we want you to be with us. In the Obama administration is, you're going to solve this, and then nobody did. And now we have a situation, we don't know what it will be, but I do believe the right answer is, we have a problem, and we've got to pull our socks up and do this. We can't let this go anymore. And that's what I think we should be striving for in terms of leadership. It is everybody willing to step up and lead to get things done. Now, one word, and I'll stop with this word. The greatest fear I hear about the incoming administration, both from the Dean's remarks, but particularly from European visitors that I meet with here, is that the Trump administration is going to lead a retreat from U.S. responsibilities and U.S. obligations around the world, leave our allies in the lurch, try to cut deals with big powers. I have to say, some of this sounds familiar, again, about the Obama administration, just putting it on steroids. But that's the fear, is this U.S. retreat, and we need the U.S. to step up and lead. Well, I think seen from this lens of people who are dissatisfied with how things have gone so far in government leadership and foreign policy, there is a sense that it's not in the U.S. It's not that the U.S. shouldn't or is not leading or shouldn't lead. We're not advocating. No one's advocating that. It's that we do, and nobody contributes, and no one comes along to the degree that we would want. So there's a sense that the U.S. is being taken for granted, taken as a chump. No one solves Syria, no one solves Libya. We have to go in and do something about Libya. No one deals with Syria. Everyone expects the U.S. to do something about Libya. Now, that's not going to happen on its own. But what I would say is part of the problem then is not the lack of U.S. leadership alone. It's also the lack of others joining in providing leadership. And the absence of both has created vacuums, which then adversaries have filled in the worst possible ways, whether it's in Libya or China or Russia or Iran or elsewhere. So rather than defining the need as the U.S. to not do what it might do and step forward, it is rather we need the U.S. and we need Europe, and we need to lead on these problems together and actually start solving them in ways that our leaders up till now really haven't been willing to do. And so that I think is the challenge before us. And I would view it, frankly, with some degree of optimism, because we have a bit of a clean slate again, and I think we can start to build. But it's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of frankness with publics, and we'll be doing it while our publics are very, very skeptical of what our governments are going to produce.
Great. Kurt, thank you so much. 3 very rich presentations, and obviously Senator Shaheen's comments. We will take kind advantage of her offer of part of bringing her into the conversation and her remarks without the benefit of having her respond. We have a nice amount of time for discussion. If I may, with the moderator's prerogative, throw out a few questions, perhaps observations. I think in some ways your 3 presentations juxtapose the structural challenges that we're finding because of the fundamental tenets being questioned, and the pragmatic of how do you, to use Chancellor Merkel's step-by-step, work towards resolution of these great challenges. So with that in mind, I sort of want to keep two minds: the structural challenges that we're facing, and then how do you move forward on a day-to-day basis. So for me, listening to Senator Shaheen and the ambassador's comments, I found a little bit of a misalignment in some ways of priorities. And I think this is getting to the concern of we are transatlantically focusing on ourselves because of the internal dynamics. I would argue, Dean Hellman, that I would add a 4th bias. There's a crisis of confidence in liberal democracies. Our economic systems have been profoundly challenged, the financial crisis, how we operate in a globalized economy, being successful in there. And then there's a crisis of democracy, whether Russia is exploiting that crisis or whether we're doing it all by ourselves. How do we manage to deal with an enormous amount of international security challenge while domestically our countries are in a fair amount of turmoil or I would say uncertainty. So with that premise, part of leadership is setting goals and priorities. Ambassador, you named a pretty lengthy list of issues that you believe the U.S.-EU relationship needs to focus on. I think Dr. Hellman, Ambassador Volker, you dealt more with sort of the structural challenge we face. What is a pragmatic priority for the U.S.-EU cooperation? Is it the Middle East? And do we focus solely on the Middle East? If President-elect Trump says ISIS is the main point, that's the anti-Daesh coalition, do we focus on that? Is it Russia, where there may be growing disagreement, potentially transatlantically, on how to address Russia? So I'll ask all three panelists, with your pragmatic hat on, what should the next year's agenda for the U.S.-EU relationship be? One or two issues, and structurally, how do we get there? Because, in some ways, Ambassador, you mentioned, well, the Middle East peace process should be a priority. Well, that may not be anything that this next administration addresses. We don't know. So does Europe do that by itself? How does it function? Where are the priorities? That was my first larger question. And then secondly, getting back to Kurt's question, how do we focus and work on ourselves, on this community of values that seems to be concerned that it's not sure if these values are important, whether we should defend these values, whether we should reform these values? That's a different conversation. I would argue the U.S.-EU relationship has always been about the external. How does it refocus itself on itself? I'm thinking of Verakunda in the early days, the G7 in the early days, when there were combinations that we focused on ourselves, very much so. That setting doesn't seem right. What's the agenda for focusing on the populism, the anti-democratic forces within our own country that are disrupting democratic institutions? So that very long-winded, my apologies, setup. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you. So I understand your first question as a bit complex, because as we have heard, we don't know in many topics. So my presentation was what European Union does. And for that, what European Union does, we need allies and we need friends. And that's in foreign policy always like this. And we are here, we follow up with our policies, and if we find friends to work with us, we will be very happy. Our priority, of course, always will be that our closest friend will be our closest ally, and it's the United States. If we work together on Syria, it will be great. If we work together on Libya, because it will be the next priority, will be great. We are very open, and we are offering all this spectrum of our priorities to the future administration, saying, look, that's where we are. This is what we were working together in the past. Maybe I added also something where we were not so close in the past or during all these past administration working together, but there are possibilities, The situation in the world is changing, not going too far away. And in the spectrum of my responsibilities, we have Latin America. Latin America is changing. Our cooperation in Latin America was not so close in the past, and we wanted to come closer with this administration. So maybe the future administration will be much closer to us and to that what we would like to do.
Excellent.
I think approaching this pragmatically and looking for immediate sort of issues in which you might sort of advance a further model of where this administration might go. I think a starting point, and an interesting starting point, would be Russia and the engagement with Russia, mostly because there's an opening, precisely linked, I think, as Ambassador Volker pointed out, that there were many areas in which the Obama administration did not have success, and in which the possibility of a new administration opens up potential opportunities for rethinking, for re-engaging, for trying to sort of shift course. So I think an early and pragmatic approach would be to see if we can use that potential opening to shift and signal a different approach, a more cooperative, a more engaged approach on issues of strategic significance and importance. And so I think an early effort to kind of demonstrate that, thinking about the U.S.-Russia relationship, thinking about how to engage with Russia in a multilateral context. Again, I would agree with the ambassador on that, because we can't do these things alone. Linking it again to the issue of Syria, which is, again, where a policy that was not successful over the course of the Obama administration, a new relationship with Russia that might influence and open up the possibility for a new multilateral approach in Syria. These are kind of opportunities. And there are opportunities, I think, that would signal, perhaps, a more pragmatic approach, perhaps begin to signal a more multilateral approach to individual problems. So I would take those areas where I think there are openings. I would essentially jump on them, try to demonstrate some forward-looking movement. I think, though, the last thing I would say is that most of the issues are going to be less planned efforts at trying to solve Middle East peace issues or rethink our alliances and Russia's role in its near abroad. Again, going back to my earlier points, I do think that much of this is going to be reactive. It's going to be reactive to events as they occur, rather than a strategic plan to say we ought to focus on reorienting our relationships east-west and then using that to deal differently with regional problems. Or we ought to rethink our trade and trade relationships in a different way as a basis for an understanding of a new economic integration paradigm. Those are big strategic questions that require fairly deep thinking and fairly kind of deep reflection about what might be the steps to get there. And that's where I don't see the depth within the team, within the emerging administration. So if you're not going to have that, the best thing I think you can do is take a few of these moments and opportunities and see how much you can make and signal a changed approach.
Perfect. Great.
Thanks. I'll say a quick word about Russia, and then I'll answer your question, Heather, in a very different way. First off, on Russia, every U.S. administration that I have come across since 1989 has started with the idea of a reset with Russia. Mostly this has been about belief that the predecessor had screwed it up and the new president knows how to do this and has the special handshake and can work with the Russians and everything's going to be fine. And every single time the Russians have behaved like Russians. And as a result, we've ended up with a very confrontational relationship. And it's very disappointing. And it has only gotten worse under Putin and with his invasion of Georgia and his invasion of Ukraine and many of the other things that he has done both domestically and internationally. So I think the reason that if there is anxiety in parts of Europe about Trump having a reset with Russia, it's because it's Trump, not because of the reset. I think that that's what a lot of Europeans would have liked. It's just that they're scared that it's Trump doing it, because then what does that mean? But ultimately, I think that this will settle back down to a more normal, confrontational, perhaps, but not explosive relationship where we try to manage disagreement and we try to figure out what we actually can do. I'm more concerned about the other side of it. I'm more concerned that we don't have, as the professor says here, a positive, a proactive agenda for what it is we're trying to do in the European area together. Where is that vision of a Europe whole and free and at peace? Where is that vision of a wider Europe and every people in Europe, whether it is an Italian people or a German people or a Slovenian people or a Georgian people or a Ukrainian people, that they have the same rights to achieve their aspirations as an independent nation as everybody else. So I think that's what's lacking here, not some hope we can work with Russia, doubt we can work with Russia, worth making the effort. Not gonna fixate on that, but I do think we got to work on the rest of Europe. Now, to your question, Heather, what should be the priority on a U.S.-EU agenda? Very important to address that question first by saying, what is the EU? Because for a long time, people used the words EU and Europe interchangeably, as though if the EU was doing something, it was all of Europe. And Europe was basically defined by the EU. Well, I don't really think that that's the way we should be thinking about it. I think Europe is a much bigger thing, a much bigger idea, and a bigger grouping of countries than the European Union. And the European Union plays a particular role as an organization of a good chunk of Europe. And even with what its own competences and responsibilities are, member states have really called the shots in much stronger ways than anyone expected after the Lisbon Treaty. When people in Washington are thinking about what are we going to do with Europe, the first thing they think of is, well, we should talk to Merkel. You know, it's German-driven. It's not Brussels. It's not the EU institutions. Yes, they're there. Yes, they do their job. Yes, they have a lot of defined bureaucratic responsibilities about the management of things day to day. But if you're talking about challenges of a serious nature, and the particularly external challenges, but even some internal challenges and decision-making about that, you're going to be going to Germany, and you're going to be wondering, well, what's the French position going to be? And you're going to be wondering, what's the UK position going to be, whether they're in or out of the EU? And then you have other parts of Europe, such as Ukraine, which are strategically critically important. What's happening there is going to define a lot of what happens in Europe in the future. And the EU, I would argue, is one player in dealing with that, and maybe not the most important player there, at least in the first instance. It's going to be others that we have to turn to, particularly on a national basis, and then even NATO. So when I say there should be a positive US-EU agenda, but I'd want to think carefully, what is the thing that the EU can deliver on and the US can deliver on with the EU, so we actually develop an effective partnership. I don't think trade is it. It could have been it, but I think we blew it, and I don't think it's coming back soon. I think we both blew it, in both in Europe and in the US. We don't have a constituency for this, so I would not expect that. What I do think there is a constituency for in Europe and in the US is there's two things. One of them is dealing with immigration, and I think we could have some work together on immigration. I think there's a constituency for growth, that we actually want to see our economy grow. We want to see the European economy grow, and if we do that, we'll ease some of our budget pressures, and it will deal with some of these populist challenges that we have. And so I think looking at ways we can build growth and stimulate transatlantic interaction around growth, that would be a good agenda. And a final one I would put out there, although I don't think it has enough public salience, is counterterrorism. There is good capacity on counterterrorism with the EU because of the interior ministries and the internal focus, and that's something that will be a priority here as well. But I think that's going to be a lower level of enthusiasm. I would focus first on the other two.
Thank you. One very final quick question for me, and then I want to grab our audience and collect some questions. Dean Hellman, it was your comment that had me jotting some notes about the Twitter diplomacy. And so I've been wrestling, and so I'll ask all of you with your practitioner hat on. I've been struck with the structural challenges of Twitter diplomacy. So when we have, whether it's Commission President Juncker or President-elect Trump, or when we are tweeting our policies immediately, there's no filter, there's no bureaucratic engagement in that. So why do we have ministries of foreign affairs, state departments, and this is happening so rapidly, so the social media transformation. When the Ukraine crisis was happening, I was looking at Twitter feeds. That was where I was getting my news. I wasn't relying on other sources. It was happening in real time. We were seeing it. How does this change modern diplomacy? Does anyone care about statements and communiques that come out? Because the foreign minister, before the meeting, if you're Minister Lavrov, we already know what that meeting is going to be before it begins. How does modern diplomacy catch up with this? I've just been wrestling with this, and I would welcome your thoughts. And Mr. Volker has an answer to this question.
I think you're making way too much out of this.
Okay.
I think Twitter is just a means of communication. People can communicate any way they want. It gets back to the things we already talked about. Have clear goals, what it is you're trying to do, know what your capabilities are, sit down and do it. Doesn't matter if people tweet about it.
Okay. Dean Hellman?
Yeah, I'm also not necessarily worried about Twitter as a form of communication. What you said, you used the words tweet policies. You don't tweet policies, right? Because in 140 characters, you don't define policy. You know, you tweet reactions again. You tweet immediate, and it is unusual, let's be clear. It is unusual for policymakers to use that form as a kind of immediate response. It does shape, to some extent, reactions. It exacerbate reactions. It creates issues and dialogues that perhaps wouldn't have been there before. You know, we are reporting on tweets as if they were policies, right. As opposed to forms of communication. So I think that partly it is our lack yet of understanding of what role this kind of form of communication plays in an overall sort of dialogue. And if we treat it, you know, as a form of communication as opposed to a forum for policy, I think we will probably have a much more reasonable approach to what it means. I do think it's much more of a campaign tool and a campaign issue than it is a policy-making forum.
I want to check those temperatures a year from now to make sure that's where we are. Ambassador, how do you, obviously we're all struck by think tanks too, social media. We want to drive. Ambassador O'Sullivan was like, okay, we're live streaming. This is a little, this is transparency. This is hard. It makes diplomacy more challenging, or you are a Twitter fiend and you are rolling the social media wave. What's your approach to this?
So I would say Twitter, you tweet policies. If it's well prepared, you do tweet policies because it's main of communication. And if you prepare your statements many times, maybe you prepare your tweet. That's other kind of reaction what you can use, of course. And we can speak about diplomacy and we speak about public diplomacy. But we have not to forget that the traditional diplomacy was not about it to come out and to speak out and to say what I do in each and every one step. You do also a lot of behind-scenes diplomacies which are leading to some negotiations and to some results which are useful then, but maybe not both the partners really want to go public and to say where we had to make the step back and where we ceased, to our partner or maybe enemy. So, of course, we use Twitter. We are more or less not obligated, but it's well seen if we do tweet. I am doing my best. I'm new in this position, so I am trying. I just 2 days ago I started with the official tweet. So
congratulations. Fantastic. Well, I think just to get back to, again, something that Senator Shaheen said, the transparency of this, when emails can be hacked and released, when phone conversations are taped and then released, there's a transparency element to our diplomacy that challenges us. There's an opportunity there for understanding, but it is a challenging role for diplomacy.
Maybe, if I may have a comment, it is very natural. If you talk to the phone, you need to count on that somebody is listening to. If you write something, you have to count on that somebody can read it, not only the person who would get it. So you need to speak and to write about it what you are really convinced it's right, and you do it. And that's it. It's such a simple thing.
Yep. And it's, I think it's retraining people to exactly think twice when you send that message. All right, let's bring our audience into it. We have colleagues with microphones. If you could raise your hand and please introduce yourself. And then we look forward to collecting a few questions, and then I'll return to the panel for their thoughts and comments. I see we have one right there. Thank you.
Hi, Rick.
Whoops, are we on? You have to.
Hi, Fred Gruen, former U.S. Commander and Consultant. I have to push back, Dean, on your point that Twitter is not a foreign policy. I think, unfortunately, as Chavez was working, Trump very much plans to make policy at 3 o'clock in the morning, 140 characters, and the same
All right, another little bit of a pushback. I see two questions right here. Wait for the microphone, please, sir. We'll start behind you and then we'll move to you. Thank you, please. Oh, I think you have to turn this on. I don't think it's on. Can you flip it on? Is there a switch? Just want to make sure we hear you.
There we go. Hi.
There we are.
There we go.
Thank you.
I'm Leah Scarnum. I'm from the Atlantic. I'm wondering what you guys think about the rise of Trump and the election of Trump and how it could affect right-wing populist parties in Europe. If by legitimizing themes of anti-globalism, anti-immigration, if that could have an effect on the parties in Europe.
Thank you. If you could just pass the microphone to the gentleman right in front of you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Charles Borowski, International Institute for Regional Studies. I would like to compliment on this panel. Many opinions and very realistic were expressed. However, it turned into some kind of a round table discussion. I think we should bring some questions and some remarks. Let me briefly make a few comments, and sorry that I am first of all mentioning that I spent recently 3 months in Europe, Eastern Europe, Central and Western. Fortunately, I speak all the languages, and I had informal conversations with people of different walks of life, from government to people down the street, and the topic was US elections. Interesting that the majority before the elections was negative towards the US, and especially towards the candidate of the Republican Party. They called it circus. However, some people mentioned that something is emerging like in the 60s, not only a social and cultural counterculture, but a political counterculture. And this shows how we in the United States, especially academia, politicians reacted to some of the theses presented in a very theatrical form.
Yes, sir. Could you just give us our question? I just want to make sure we get a lot
So
of
briefly,
yes.
The question is how, the conclusion was, how can we trust the US in exporting democracy when the history shows so many gaps? And they give example, for instance, the revolution in Hungary. Much talk, no help. Cuba, next door. And how did we support democracy by continuing racial and other battles? I've been in Cuba several times.
Thank you.
And my question is, how can we restore credibility? Because this Europeans expect, and not words, declaration of different policies, but actual policies.
Thank
and that's
you.
the basic to the panel.
Thank you. Why don't we, so we have sort of a bit of a pushback on what happens if we do have policy by tweet. How does this election, what is the influence in Europe and other similar anti-parties? And then how do you restore U.S. credibility? Who would like to start on that gauntlet?
I'm
Mr.
happy
Volker.
to.
Good.
And I think I can do them briefly. First off, on credibility of democracy. To restore credibility of democracy, you need democratically elected governments to be successful, solve problems that people are worried about. And right now, they don't see it. And so they keep looking for alternatives, some of which are challenging to some of the democratic institutions and practices that we've had. We need our leaders to be a little bit bolder and a little bit more decisive and get some things done. And then I think people can have confidence in those governments. On tweeting policy, I completely agree with the professor here. I don't think tweeting is policy. Tweeting is commentary, and tweeting is attitude. But policy is when you actually have a decision in front of you. You have whatever people assemble within a government to influence and inform that decision. It is recorded and is acted upon. That's not a tweet. Tweet is just venting steam. And I really do think we have to differentiate. When we want what we care about with governance is what we actually do. Don't get distracted by the Twitterverse. And finally, is Trump influencing the rise of right-wing parties in Europe? I would say it the other way around. The phenomena that have given rise to right-wing parties in Europe are similar to the phenomena that have given rise to Trump and others in the US. And people may take encouragement from that and say, see, the Brexit vote won, we can win here. But I don't think it's causal. I think it is all reacting to the same set of phenomena, which gets back to the broader issues about how governments are performing in the eyes of voters.
I don't have much more to add to that, actually. I very much agree. On the latter issue, I think we are talking about a mutually reinforcing sort of set of shifts linked to obviously domestic reactions to both economic, social, and identity issues associated with global integration. And I think they manifest themselves in different ways, in different forms, in different countries. But there are sort of similar pressures. And I think what's the mutually reinforcing part creates some degree of worry, because in each one you tend to say we're now part of a global trend rather than a domestic, purely domestic response. And I think that has implications, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's sort of Trump, essentially creating the conditions. So I think that's important. It's important to understand, and I think this is the great challenge for us, to understand what is sort of driving that. I do think there has been, at least at this early stage, somewhat of an economically reductionist story to that wave, that it's the losers of globalization who are coming out. And I think there is, of course, a strong economic dimension to it. I think what we haven't truly confronted yet is the importance of identity and identity politics and people's understanding of their own national identity and what that means and how that plays out in the political realm. I think we just haven't been in a set of election cycles in which identity issues have been as critical, or as obviously critical. I think they have been critical in others, but they're here so openly important. And I think we need to rethink what that means and how that's sort of shaping some of this response. And on Twitter, and again, I don't want to go too far into the Twitter story, but I think to me what's most important and what most sort of to some extent troubling is that we haven't seen the policy framework yet, right? So we've seen the reactive bits to news events, to internet, but we don't know yet what the policy framework is likely to be. So as the ambassador mentioned, when you see Twitter as one form of a policy discussion in which you are then communicating policy issues that come out, I have no problem with that. Here, what I don't see yet is the kind of the policy responses that are shaping a worldview or an understanding of regional problems or understanding of threats and risks, which this is one element of a communication strategy to engage with a larger public. And I think it's the absence of that fundamental policy thinking that concerns me. And as I said earlier in my remarks, in particular, I don't sort of see the mechanisms for which that strategic thinking is going to develop and grow. It's difficult to do that strategic thinking in the midst of the maelstrom. When you're governing, you're often constantly reacting to events. You rely, I think, on a deeper wellspring of foreign policy expertise and strategic thinking that has been honed over long periods of time, in some sense, not always producing sort of success, but at least creating the basis for understanding of a policy framework. And that's what I don't see in the Twitterocracy that we're facing here.
And Ambassador, I just want to, specifically on the credibility question, I am hearing, as we're meeting with colleagues that are visiting Washington from Europe, there is a question of, is the U.S. going to be a reliable partner? This is the election has shaken them, whether it's Twitter statements or just uncertainty about the future. Does that play a role in your day-to-day work about just questioning, A, what the policy framework is, but two, is there a credibility concern that's going to interfere with your day-to-day work?
I don't think so. As I said, we had our common policies and collaboration before. We very much hope it will come also in the future. We know now it's transition period. We need to wait a bit. We need to see who will be the Secretary of State, who will be the important key players here in the State Department and in other offices. And of course, we have our hopes, but still we are, as I said, we are looking to our key partner, looking into the future and saying, okay, so we need to wait, we will do what we are doing, and maybe it will be attractive and interesting for the United States again to engage with us, you know? But we will be there still with our policies. Coming back a bit to the credibility and to the European politics, of course, you know, we are looking across the Atlantic and asking us what will come, you know, what will happen. Nobody knows. But of course, this all is not influencing very much the everyday life of our citizens. They are much more preoccupied by migration now, by the economic situation in the country, by the globalization, and the logical reaction of them is then to choose the party and vote for the party which speaks for them and which they hope they would do what they expect for their future. So you can see right-wing parties, you can see social democrats coming to the power, you can see also left-wing parties in Europe. But a special phenomenon in the last years, I would say, is that very good, well-known businessmen are coming into the politics. And this is new trend in Europe. When you look many times also to Eastern European countries, you have you have businessmen who are politicians, because the people are hoping that if he is very good businessman, maybe he will manage so well also the country. That's the future, because these mistrust many times to these traditional political parties, which had been there for a long time, is there, and they have new hope, and these people are coming to the power. And I think that's the new trend now.
Fascinating. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. I know I've ignored this side of the shop. If we have one right back there, please, and then we'll take the colleague right here. Oh, you may have to turn it on. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Jeanne. I'm from the Netherlands Embassy. I wanted to come back also on the issue of credibility, and particularly addressing it to Ambassador Volker. You mentioned that the credibility of democratically elected leaders is restored when they are successful. But I'm wondering, because I guess all people who are democratically elected, they aim to be successful, and they're equally frustrated with the public when they are not. And sometimes you see that the expectations of the public also are quite high. And I was wondering, do you see that there is a change in what governments can actually do, in the role of governments, and pragmatically, like, where is their added value, what can they do?
Thank you. And there was a question right there. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Andreas Ross with the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. My question is similar. If our times are defined by these two parallel challenges, on the one hand, global crises, many of which have been mentioned, that seem to be intractable, extremely complex, certainly not to be solved just by a will of added leadership. And on the other hand, these large populations that are losing trust in their governments. In everybody's views on the panel, to what extent are the solutions to these two challenges mutually exclusive? Where if you give these, maybe they're not majorities, but large minorities of the population who feel they're not heard, if you give them what they want to hear, how does that make it harder to actually do the job of solving these problems or drilling these hard boards? Thanks.
Thank you. I think, well, because those are two sort of mutually reinforcing questions, let me have the panelists conclude on those comments and then add any final thoughts, your parting words. If you were advising High Representative Mogherini, Commission President Juncker, President-elect Trump, what advice would you give them for next year's U.S.-EU relationship? So with those two questions, Kurt, I will look to you to start, and we'll work down the point.
I'm reminded of something George Robertson, former UK Defence Secretary and Secretary General, said when he was mentoring one of his younger Labour Party colleagues who was asking him, how do you do exactly the sort of questions? And his answer was, if you're not comfortable riding two horses at the same time, what are you doing in this circus? And there is an element of that, that politicians shouldn't expect to be loved. They shouldn't expect to always be successful. They shouldn't expect to be recognized for their successes, and they should expect to be blamed for things over which they have no control. That's the nature of the job. And if you accept that as the nature of the job, then you can get on with figuring out, what can I do? And there, I do think that there are things. I understand the premise of your question, the guy from FAS, about, gee, if you really want to tackle these international challenges seriously, that's so much international commitment and engagement that publics are going to be fed up with that, and they won't support that. Yeah, I see that point. The other way around, though, is to think of it in terms of what is it that is affecting our publics, or that they perceive that is affecting them, and how can governments be responsive to that? And it may not solve serious problem, but maybe you can solve it at least in terms of what's happening inside Germany or inside the UK. And that is at least a starting point to rebuild some trust. I agree with the premise of your question, though. We're never going to solve these problems without much, much broader solutions. And a part of that as well is we have to recognize that crises that go unaddressed in the world get worse. So we can't look at a crisis and say it's not our problem. What we have to do is choose what can we do and how can we do things, and try to actually get at it. But at the same time, it's important that we start with what's actually motivating and affecting our publics to begin with.
Excellent. Dean Hellman.
I'm not sure that that it's necessarily mutually exclusive. Obviously the domestic sort of reaction and the kind of intractability of the structural problems. I do agree with you that necessarily new leaders, some of these issues are so deep, require such sort of significant rethinking that it's not necessarily new leader comes in, new leader will kind of cut through the thicket and create a sort of solution set. I don't necessarily, though, think that what's preventing the effort to seriously rethink some of the basic sort of structural kind of problems that are producing the tensions that we discussed in this panel, I don't think that's necessarily undermined or constrained by the kind of the domestic, by the domestic discontent. To some extent, I think one part of the domestic extent is an expression of frustration that our global engagements are not necessarily reducing the risks that they sort of see from outside of their borders. And I think there is a desire and interest and a willingness to think about, are there new solutions that might reduce those risks, that might lead to more constructive engagement, that might lead to kind of greater sources of growth through economic engagement. So I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. But I do think that they are going to require not just the notion of a leader changing it, but that a leader creating the opportunity for a deeper rethinking of these issues. And that's really, as I said earlier in my remarks, the fundamental concern that I have. I just don't see the mechanisms by which that's going to happen in the current administration, in the upcoming administration. Now, what could be done, and I think what's the critical next step? I actually think the biggest issue, and it's going to remain this way for the next year, is precisely where we kind of started off on this panel, which is the uncertainty. The sense that we really don't know what this administration's understanding, of key regional and global problems are, what their priority list is going to be of things they want to engage in, and how they want to engage multilaterally. And I think that uncertainty, which is not surprising in the early stages of when an administration has yet, of course, to be even formed. But of course, everyone reading the tea leaves, reading the tweets, and reading any kind of signal that gives that. But we have to move more quickly for ways in which to reduce that uncertainty. And I think, therefore, that a kind of a clear statement of policies and priorities, a clear effort to sort of state a worldview that's sort of underlying relationships with Europe, that getting the opportunity out through speeches, through policy statements, through other mechanisms is going to be important to just reduce that level of uncertainty, because I think it's the level of uncertainty that, if it maintains itself throughout the early years of the administration, I think will create even more problems as we have to react to these kind of inevitable challenges from these structural problems that we talked about today.
Ambassador.
So I think we need to listen, we need to try to understand, we need to see where are the priorities. We need to gain trust, the mutual trust. This is always important between the partners. And we need to try engage and to simply present our priorities and that what we think could be our common priorities. That's it.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to slightly tweak Michel Barnier's comments yesterday about remaining calm and keep negotiating. I think our mantra is remain calm, keep engaging. That's what the U.S.-EU relationship is going to need to do. I think that is a Twitterable comment, so perhaps that's not a policy, that's a reaction. But please join me in thanking three great panelists and terrific conversation. Thank you. And I think we'll take a coffee break if my colleagues from the EU make sure that I can release you to coffee, and then we'll come back for the second panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, we will begin our second panel very shortly. Thank you.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you.
Yeah, the first session is really good turnout. Discussion. How are you? Thanks for coming. Just going to bring the room to order and then it's all yours. Feels like it's good times, eh? Ladies and gentlemen, if those of you still getting coffee could take your seats, we'll begin. And for our second panel, we're going to talk about jobs, growth and prosperity. Delighted to welcome our moderator, Andrea Montanino, who's Director of the Global Business and Economics Program at the Atlantic Council. Andrea, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, James. Can you hear me? It works? Yes. Okay, so I would really want to thank the EU delegation for hosting this extremely timely conference on EU-U.S. relations ahead of the start of the new administration. And I'm really delighted to moderate the panel this morning. If we only followed recent media coverage on Europe, it would appear that Europe was jumping from one crisis to the other. And recent events in my home country, Italy, seems to show this. But however, if you look at facts and figures, especially on jobs and growth, the story is slightly different. It's not only crisis. I would say it's not crisis at all. The facts are that the EU GDP is now higher than before the 2008 crisis. And GDP in some member states, it's even 10% above its lowest point. In its autumn forecast, the European Commission forecast economic growth for Europe going ahead at a moderate pace, but a relatively strong rate, 1.6% for 2017. Employment is growing. Unemployment is set to fall from 8.6% this year to 7.9% in 2018. So there are positive numbers coming out. But of course, this is not probably sufficient to absorb the level of unemployment that Europe experienced in the last years during the crisis. So future jobs growth and prosperity are of course dependent on a lot of factors. Sometimes are national, so what European member states can do for foster economic growth. Sometimes it's, say, regional, what the European institutions can do to create more jobs. And sometimes it's global, what this country will do, how this country will engage with Europe, how will engage with in economic cooperation. And again, other factors might be in the hands of the policymakers. Some factors are not in the hands of policymakers. So it's very difficult to predict the future, but I think it's important today to see how the two major areas, economic areas of the world, European Union and the United States, can really cooperate for create more prosperity, not just for the two areas, but for the world as a whole. Let me introduce the panelists. David O'Sullivan is the ambassador of the European Union to the United States since 2014. He oversees the EU bilateral relationship with the U.S. and the direction and work of the EU delegation, including political, economic, and commercial affairs. David has a long and distinguished career that spans 5 decades. 5 decades? I don't know who wrote this.
No, not possible.
Not
no,
possible.
No.
Come on. So he
I started when I was in nappies.
He started at the kindergarten where in Ireland, and then he moved through a lot of steps in his European career. I mean, you all know David. Then we have Fred Bergstein, Senior Fellow and Director Emeritus. He was the founding director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Next to Fred, Karam Bhatia. He serves as Vice President and Senior Counsel, Global Government Affairs and Policy for General Electric. And at my far left, Dalibor Rohak is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies European political and economic trends. So the way I would like to do this discussion is to give the floor to each of the 4 panelists for a few minutes to set the stage, tell us how they see relations between EU and US going forward on an economic perspective, and then I will pose some questions. As I said before, I want this panel as informal as possible, so be ready to jump and comment and criticize what the person that speaks before you will do. I will open the floor to questions from the audience, of course, so be ready to be tough with anybody, and all the questions you would like to ask about US-EU economic relations, it's time to do. So maybe, David, we can start from you.
Okay, so who do I get to criticize then, Andrea?
No, you start. You're the first because the others can.
No, right. I've got what I'm being set up as, yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot, Andrea, and thank you all for sticking with us after a very interesting panel discussion on security and foreign policy. Look, I'll try to be reasonably brief because I'd really like the other panelists to give us their views, since they're going to give us the US perspective on this. I think the European perspective is reasonably well known. I mean, sometimes I think in these occasions you just need to go back to fundamentals. I mean, the Transatlantic Economic Corridor is the single most important corridor in the world. On a daily basis, we are trading, 5 trillion levels of activity. We represent, depending on how you count it, 50% of GDP, 30% of world trade. We each are more heavily invested in each other than either of us is in any other region. Our companies make more money through their investments in the US or in the EU than they do in any other region of the world. And we create, across transatlantically, 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic through our investment and our trade. These are the fundamentals. This is unaffected by the results of the election. This is where we are, and I think this is going to continue. And there is a vast amount of economic activity across this transatlantic corridor, which is, absolutely fundamental to our joint economic futures. Much of this, let us be honest, happens without too much intervention from public policy makers. It's just businesses going about their business because you have a relatively business-favorable environment in the United States, and we have a relatively business-friendly environment in Europe. We have the rule of law, we have predictability, we have a high level of capital activity. And so this, in my view, is the fundamental. As Andrea says, I sometimes think, and I think it's important to repeat it here, people I spend a lot of my time trying to explain that Europe is actually in slightly better economic shape than the headlines would have you believe. And by the way, I think this is recognized by economic actors. I was in New York last week talking to a lot of hedge funds and investment companies, and they're all relatively, I emphasize, upbeat about possibilities in Europe, still seeing it as a very good place to invest and to locate, and still seeing business opportunities. It's true, I think we had a less good crisis than the US. I like to say the US had a better crisis than we did. You were better able to respond with TARP and stimulus. We had to go through some painful moments of rebalancing the way in which economic and monetary union was functioning. We had a sort of bigger sovereign debt crisis which we had to manage. I think we have come through that. I'm not complacent and I'm not smug about this, but I think Andrea's point is fundamental. We have come through it. We are now returning to positive growth. We are seeing a fall in unemployment. And I think the economic fundamentals in Europe are actually quite positive, and I think that the basis for further cooperation between us is definitely there. If you look at the agenda which we are pursuing, the Juncker Commission, the Jobs and Growth Agenda, you look at the Investment Initiative, you look at Digital Single Market, Energy Union, Capital Markets Union, these are hugely transformative projects. And once again, I sometimes think our American friends don't quite understand how important these things are as they put in place on a daily basis decisions which further integrate the European economy and which create better business conditions and better economic conditions. And this is really work that is going ahead. And on a daily basis, if you just follow the headlines of what's being decided in Europe almost daily, you will see that these decisions are being taken. The digital single market is being put in place, energy union, the investments are happening, the connectors. We are going to create in the next couple of years a fully integrated energy market in Europe, which with respect is something you don't even have in the United States. And I think Capital Markets Union, which is where, for once, we're saying we absolutely have to learn from the Americans who do this better than we do. We are also taking very important decisions. It's a more complex discussion, but we have started down that road. And one of the things I always point out to people about the European Union, we grind slowly, but we grind finally. We take a bit of time, but once we launch ourselves on a project, we normally bring it to a successful conclusion, even if we have a few deviations and hiccups along the way. Also, I would like to emphasize that on the issue of trade, and I know this has been a difficult discussion on both sides of the Atlantic, but there is a tendency here in America to say, yeah, well, you can't do trade deals either in Europe. This is not true. The Canada agreement, which is one of the most ambitious agreements which we have concluded between the EU and another developed country, has been signed, will be approved, will enter into force in the spring. We are proceeding with an agreement in Asia. We're concluded with Vietnam. We've concluded with Singapore. We are about to conclude, I think, with a bit of luck, with Japan in the early spring. We have further ambitious agendas with Indonesia, Philippines, and ASEAN as a whole, also Australia and New Zealand. We are upgrading our first generation free trade agreement with Mexico to make it into a sort of 21st century free trade agreement. We're doing the same thing with Chile, which was a free trade agreement we signed in 2001, and we are negotiating with Mercosur. If Cecilia Malmström, the Commissioner for Trade, completes her trade agenda during the term of her mandate, Europe will be at the center of the largest free trade network the world has ever seen. And while trade remains a difficult subject for all the reasons we know, I think there is a very firm commitment in Europe that we've invented trade, we live by trade, and we intend to continue to open up markets, because we know that at the end of the day, this is where a good part of our growth will come, given the fact that as President Barroso used to say, about 80% of growth is going to happen outside the developed world as we know it. And then finally, in relation to the US, I think that on the trade agenda, look, we were not able to finish TTIP this year. I think my personal view as an experienced trade negotiator is we just ran out of road. I think people say it was political. Actually, technically speaking, we just didn't get all the work done that we would have needed to get to a point of political decision. I think we need another year or two of work to get to that point. Cecilia Malmström and Mike Froman have agreed to take a screenshot of where we have got to, and a lot of very good work has been done over the last 3.5 years. This will be passed to the new administration. We stand willing to continue those discussions if the new administration wishes. If they have other ideas, we will obviously listen to what they have to say and try to figure out, is there a trade agenda still to be developed between the United States and Europe? We believe that there is a very good possibility of a good trade deal to be done, but of course we wait to hear what the new administration will say. The final point I would just make, if I may, Andrea, and I'm sorry, I will then stop, is just maybe to pick up a bit on what Ambassador Volker said in the earlier panel about foreign policy, but it's something I detect in certain Republican circles here in DC. The EU is not Europe, I agree. And the EU is the EU and its member states. And by the way, many of our member states are present. I have 28 ambassador colleagues here in DC who are active in promoting the national agendas of their countries, and this is right. We are not a federal state, so we're not seeking to obliterate the role of member states. But the EU remains the indispensable actor in Europe for achieving many of the objectives of any U.S. administration, whether that is jobs growth, whether that's immigration, whether that's counterterrorism. We will not always be the exclusive actor, but if the EU can't achieve these goals, then it's unlikely to happen simply by working through 28 or 35 or how many individual member states in an uncoordinated way. And I think this is fundamental. So it's not a question, in my view, it's not either or, you work with the EU or you work with member states. You need to do both, and I think any administration would be mad not to do both. But equally, I think there are many objectives, particularly in the jobs and growth agenda, where the EU, as such, is going to be the indispensable actor in delivering the outcomes that we all want for our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just because I'm the moderator, I want to change my agenda. So I have a question for you before giving the floor to the others. How you can convince European citizens that the EU is indispensable? Because one of the reasons behind all this raising populism is also because people do not believe anymore on the European project or European institutions, I think. So how you can make a case for a European Union skepticals?
Well, I mean, look, I'm the first to acknowledge that we have a problem of popular enthusiasm for the European project, let me put it that way. Jacques Delors famously said, you don't fall in love with the single market, you don't fall in love with energy union, you don't feel passionate about capital markets union, let's be honest. But on the other hand, if you look at the opinion polls, I'm sorry, actually, support for the European Union has gone up in recent months. By the way, most notably after the Brexit vote. It went up very dramatically in many countries. If you look at the Eurobarometer polls, which are polls we've been doing for the last 30 years, support for the European institutions or respect for the European institutions is consistently higher than the respect people have for their national institutions. Now, how do I reconcile these things? Yes, they are contradictory. Because people want the benefits, understand the benefits, but resent some of the inconveniences, some of the sort of constraints on national sovereignty in some areas from time to time. So I don't deny that we have a problem, but I also think that people fundamentally get that without the European Union, their lives would be less good than they are today. So I think we have a lot of work to do, but I do think, and I think if you look, it's a mistake to overinterpret some of the Eurosceptic comments as relating exclusively to the EU. It very often just relates to general unhappiness with life and how people feel, and that it varies enormously from member state to member state because economic outcomes are different. Constant membership of the European Union still delivers different outcomes in different member states in function of their policy choices, because membership of the European Union still leaves member states a high degree of choice about the trade-offs they make between taxation, social welfare, free market, regulation, and so forth. So I think we have a challenge, but I'm actually rather more confident in the fact that our citizens, globally speaking, think that the EU is on balance much better than any alternative that anyone can put forward.
Thank you, David. Fred.
Unlike the ambassador, I take great pride in the fact that I have spent 5 decades working in this field and plan to draw on that extensive experience in my remarks today. I will actually wind up pretty close to where he did, but I want to make some preliminary remarks that I think intensify the importance of his wind-up remarks, and, as I'm going to put it, pose a big challenge to the European Union, Europe more broadly, in helping to deal with some of the potential problems that we may face in the next few years. Now, we of course do not know what the Trump administration will actually do once it takes office. But we do know that a number of the things that the president-elect and the candidate, Donald Trump, said pose at least two potentially existential problems for the world economy. The narrower of the two, I stress the narrower of the two, though it's not narrow, is the risk of ending the tendency, the trend toward steady liberalization of world trade and investment of the last 70 years. When he talks about ripping up trade agreements, be it NAFTA, be it Chorus, be it exiting the TPP, which is a tragedy, even potentially raising questions about the future of the U.S. role in the World Trade Organization, all those things at a minimum raise the possibility of stopping the trend toward ever more open world economy. And if you believe in the bicycle theory, which I invented a long time ago, you believe that if you don't keep moving forward, you tend to fall back. So even that modest version of an interpretation of what he might do is serious. But of course, if he went further and did some of the other things he's talked about, big tariffs on China, Mexico, company-by-company tariffs to stop their exporting jobs, so-called, from the U.S., then all that would actually push the bicycle backward, begin to reverse course, and move the world economy away from the liberalization and openness of the last 70 years, which has been absolutely central to all of our prosperity and stability. Now, that's the narrower problem that is raised by a potential Trump policy in these areas. The broader problem goes to global economic leadership. We know from history that unless there is a country or some small group of countries that are willing to provide leadership, not just in trade, but in finance and development assistance and a whole range of other topics, unless there is leadership of that type, then the world economy is at risk. The United States has provided a lot of that leadership over the last 70 years. So in particular, if it withdrew, or worse, reversed, then it would be calamitous, I think, for the world as a whole. Again, even a withdrawal of U.S. leadership would be bad, a withdrawal from pushing the world in positive directions. But if the U.S. reversed course, as I was suggesting could happen on trade, it would, of course, be worse. But if the U.S. simply abdicated its leadership, stood still, focused inwardly, did not participate constructively in the whole range of international economic discussions, that already would create a leadership vacuum. Call it a G0 world. Nobody to lead. No G2, no G5, no G7. G0 world with nobody playing the leadership role. Now, some of you who are scholars in this area know that the famous MIT professor Charlie Kindleberger explained the Great Depression of the 1930s in exactly these terms. His argument was that the demise of global economic leadership and the vacuum that resulted in the 1930s was what made the Great Depression great. There was nobody who stepped into the breach to stop the currency wars, the trade wars, the concatenation of actions and reactions that took the world into deep depression. Why? Well, the traditional leader, the United Kingdom, had lost its ability to lead, and the follower, the natural follower, the United States, was not yet ready to do so. And so there was a vacuum. Now, you could pose the same possibility today, and many people already have, way before we got to a Trump presidency, that the United States was declining in its ability to provide at least the kind of leadership it has. The Chinese, who are the next natural leader, are not yet ready, that's for sure. And the EU, which is at least a plausible equal partner for that leadership role, has seemed to be inwardly focused, has its own economic problems, has not yet shown the ability to act as a unit in order to provide that kind of global role. So this broader problem, potential problem raised by a Trump international economic stance is the demise of global leadership. Therefore, the absence of global public goods, be it a key currency, be it international lending, be it an open market, be it a lender of last resort, as the Fed has been in previous crises, if all of those things disappear, the world is in big trouble. And so the question is, if such a situation were to emerge, what to do about it? It seems to me it then becomes incumbent on the other major economies to help counter these risks and fill the gap as much as possible. And I would submit that would be particularly the case, more than for anybody else, for the European Union. As the U.S. best friend in managing the global economy for the last 70 years. For a long time, the U.S. and EU did play sort of a G2 role in managing the world trading system, right up at least through the Uruguay round, and still in many respects does so. So the mantle would almost necessarily fall to the EU to pick up that leadership gap, both through its own actions and through trying to work on the U.S. not to falter more than anybody else. I have one specific proposal to try to promote that, and that picks up then what the ambassador said at the end of his remarks. I think the focus of EU policy as the Trump administration begins and as transatlantic relations start to find their new focus, what the EU should do is not just, as the ambassador said, wait to see what the Trump administration thinks about TTIP, but in fact push it very hard. Because I think TTIP is the most promising prospect to avoid the adverse risks that I feared from a Trump administration, deterioration of trade, absence of world leadership. TTIP could essentially jump the queue with the TPP dead at least for a while and provide a new forward positive momentum for global economic cooperation, liberalization, and forward movement. Why do I say that? Well, TTIP is the one major U.S. trade agreement, present or past, that candidate Trump never criticized. And there's a reason for that. The reason that anti-trade people don't like NAFTA or KORUS or TPP is that they include low-wage countries who might compete, countries with low labor standards, countries with low environmental standards. That's the trilogy of complaints from the AFL-CIO and other anti-trade forces, not just from the Republican right, to be sure, against trade. None of those apply, of course, to the EU. We know that. And so, whether it had been a President Clinton or a President Trump, I would think TTIP provides the largest opportunity to move not just the U.S.-European relation, critical as that is, but the whole global economic system with a new positive and forward momentum. I was delighted that the ambassador reminded everybody here of the enormous progress the EU has been making. I happened to be in Canada the day that their prime minister was scheduled to fly over and sign the agreement. They were traumatized. I assured them, I said, France, Germany, and the rest of the EU is not going to let Wallonia block this agreement. And of course, it happened within 48 hours. And the ambassador ticked off the enormous range of things Europe is doing on trade. It is showing global leadership. And if the U.S. actually does fall into repose on those issues, as looks to be the case, at least early in the Trump administration, the EU is de facto the leader in pursuing a global trade system of the kind we all want, and the ambassador made that very clear. Therefore, I would urge him to expand a little bit on that final comment. Instead of just waiting, see what the Trump people say, give them a push. Help them. Help them to think in the constructive, positive direction on TTIP. Now, it may have to take on a new name. It may have to change some of the details. The timing may have to be rejiggered, sure. let Trump claim credit and victory for having improved the deal for American workers. That's fine. That's what he wants to do. I'm sure you could work that out in a good, skillful negotiation of the type that the ambassador himself has pursued many times in the past. But take that as a serious, top priority responsibility, because without it, I fear we may all be in serious trouble.
Thanks. Thank you, Fred. I will have a lot of follow-up questions, but I will put later, and I'll pass to Karan.
Great. Well, I've merely been in the trade business for a mere 2 decades, so I'm not going to even begin to try and compete with the two folks to my right. I think I'm up here to represent the perspective of sort of multinational business, which I'm happy to put that hat on for purposes of just a few brief comments. Look, the first is to just underscore and maybe add a little bit of context to what David said, which is take a deep breath. The U.S.-EU economic trade investment relationship remains super strong, right? If you look at it at an underlying day-to-day level, the way our business people do, not our government affairs, not our policy people, but the people who are actually running this business every day, Europe and the United States are so deeply integrated just inside my one company. We have research facilities in Europe, research facilities in the United States that are literally handing off research projects between each other day in, day out. We have executives from the United States living in Europe working on projects there. We have executives from Europe living in the United States doing so here. We have more than 100,000 employees in the United States. We have more than 100,000 employees in Europe. Projects around the world get sourced and staffed by people living in both continents. So, to worry, the context that you hear a lot of this discussed in is that we're going to go back to some autarkic world before. That simply is implausible. There is such deep integration. And I can tell you from my vantage point, as I look at the experience that I've seen from my company, GE, in Europe in just the last few years, we're getting more deeply integrated. We're investing more there, and we are seeing many of our European partners invest more over here. So I think the first thing I would say is just to level set and grant. Now, do we support TTIP? Absolutely. If TTIP never happens, is it going to be a significant problem for our existing businesses? No, it's not. We're going to continue operating the way we have. Point one. The second point that I would say is that does not mean to say that policy does not matter. There is a heck of a lot of policy that's being debated in both Europe and in the United States that are going to have a significant fundamental impact on the strength of our business in both places. And they are in areas that are being widely discussed in both places. David's referenced some of them, issues like digital union, energy union in Europe. I think tax reform is a significant issue. I think the regulation of labor markets is going to be a very significant issue. I think competition and antitrust policy in both jurisdictions are very significant issues that will fundamentally impact both how companies like ours do in each place and the strength of the bilateral, the relationship across the transatlantic. But those are outside of the realm of sort of classic trade policy. So I guess I would say, to the extent we are worried about the strength of the underlying economics, let's make sure we spend enough attention focused on the other areas of policymaking that are going to fundamentally impact the economy. Now, I will point out one area where I think trade policy on both sides does need to bear specific focus, and it is with respect to both Europe's and the United States' trade policies with respect to the rest of the world. And that, I come back to an old hobby horse of mine, but I truly do believe that there is the occasion for more coordinated approaches between the U.S. and the EU with respect to third countries and their practices. This is something that David and I used to talk about, I know, when we were both in the trade world. And I think there's more that can be done there without any reference to TTIP, without any reference to free trade agreements. That's simply a matter of being coordinated as we look to develop Europe more as an export platform as well as the United States. I guess the final point that I would go to is we are not, however, ignorant of the trend that we see happening in both the United States and Europe and the rest of the world from a political perspective. Clearly, there is a greater strand of populism that we're seeing. Clearly, we're seeing, to some extent, more and more decentralization, I think, would be the point, certainly in Europe, and I think to some extent that case can be made here, which does have some interesting repercussions from a policy-making perspective, which is, from my vantage point, much as we have traditionally focused on Brussels and Washington, I do think you're seeing companies like ours spend more time focusing at the quote-unquote local level. And I think in the United States, that means you're going to see more and more attention paid to innovation and the policy-making front that's happening at the state and city level. And in Europe, you're going to see as much attention or more being paid to the member states, and maybe even with sub-member state level than ever before. And I'm not sure that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think for us, what it is reminding us is that while we are a multinational company, we also really need to be a multi-local company. We need to be invested in and engaged in and shaping policy at the state and national and member state level as much as ever before, because those are going to be key drivers of overall economic success as well. So I'll stop there.
Correct. Just a question to follow up what you said. You said it's, of course, implausible to imagine a world where there is no trade between U.S. and EU, or less trade. But for a moment, try to think that the trends that Fred just mentioned, so the reverse in liberalization happens, which kind of impact can have in practice for a company like yours? I mean, in your daily business, because I imagine you have, research and development center in one place and, I don't know, manufacturing in the others. So how this kind of reverse trend can really affect the daily business of a multinational company like yours?
So, look, we can have a discussion about which of, and I don't discount Fred's scenarios at all. I think we have to wrestle with them because they are out in the policy discourse. But I guess I would say two things. One, the notion, that some of the things that are being talked about here would be implemented in a way that would take us back to an era where there was no integrated innovation, or there was no integrated supply chains, even assuming that that's really what's being proposed, and I'm not sure it is. I think that there would be so many forces stepping in because the consequences would be so almost catastrophic for global welfare that I just don't think that's ultimately going to happen. But I think the second thing that I will say, and I do think this is true, and this in some ways dovetails with my final point about sort of the increasing focus on localization. I do think that is happening, and I do think that you're seeing companies, including my company, increasingly focus on strengthening its local capabilities in different countries, different regions, different states around the world. To some extent, that's simply the fact that policymaking is devolving down into those places. Washington has been a less capable place of creating policies that unite and driving forward, and so you're seeing more and more of it flow down locally. And globally, we've seen sort of the proliferation of protectionist, or whatever you want to call them, kinds of requirements globally that is having that impact as well. The Peterson Institute's done some very interesting work around this, and I think you see it happening writ large. So I'm not saying that there aren't consequences to some of the policy, the things that are happening. I'm just simply saying that, I think the notion of retreating back to some sort of almost 19th century vision of balkanized trade is not realistically what anybody's talking about.
Thank you, Karen. Dalibor. Sorry, before you take the floor, I invite you to think about your questions, because after Dalibor's speech, I will also open the floor to the audience.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. I should probably preface my remarks by saying that I'm not your typical Eurosceptic right-winger that you might have expected by getting somebody from AEI here.
We are not interested anymore. Thank you very much.
I very much want the European project to succeed. One reason I want the European project to succeed is because I was born in the 1980s on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and I sort of know what the counterfactual to a united and open Europe looks like. And indeed, earlier this year, I published a book that I commend to your attention, which is called Towards an Imperfect Union, a conservative case for the EU, that tries to make a free market conservative case for European integration. So you can buy that on Amazon. It would make for a wonderful Christmas gift. But I would like to, in my 5 minutes, echo some of Fred's remarks. I really think that this is not the moment to take a deep breath and wait and see how things shape up. I think that, protectionism is already on the rise. It's not a hypothetical question. I mean, it is happening. Number of violations of WTO rules have been steadily rising over the past year or 2 years. We now rejoice, as we did on Sunday, when a proto-fascist candidate in an EU member state loses by a 4% margin in the second round of a presidential election. I think these are really dangerous, unhinged times. And it is a very common and tempting fallacy to assume that because something is just too difficult to imagine, that it therefore can't happen. I mean, it can. We can go back to a world that's much less hospitable to liberal democracy, much less hospitable to free enterprise and trade. What I'd like to talk about is what I believe has been one part of the build-up of the current problem on the European side. I don't think it's a most important part. I don't necessarily think it's the only part, but I think it's one of the sources of frustrations, if you will, that perhaps European electors have with the European project. So for decades, we've heard from European leaders, from generations of European leaders, that the European project was going from strength to strength. Right? There was the Single European Act, Treaty of Maastricht, introduction of the euro, Treaty of Nice, Constitution for Europe, Lisbon Treaty. We were always told that this was that each of those was the step towards a golden age of European prosperity. In 1989, Jacques Delors famously stated that community is back under orderly management, and this laxity, this discipline will enable the community to keep pace with the economies of its major trading partners. In 2002, Romano Prodi promised that the enlargement would give impetus to trade, investment, education, research, and economic growth. In 2013, we heard from Mr. Van Rompuy that we are putting our house in order, and results are already starting to show. Today, the Eurozone in 2013, he says, is already in a better shape than 12 months ago. But look at the data. What has been happening in the meantime, as we've been listening to this sequence of promises and cheerful assessments of European economy. Well, there have been first of all, there have been relative decline. If in 1989 the European economy accounted for 1/3 of the global economy, today is 20%, and I know that one large part of that story has to do with the rise of China and India and other emerging economies, and that's something to be celebrated, of course. But at the same time, European economy has been losing steam. You look at average growth rates in the past decade, you compare them with average growth rates in the previous decade, it's barely half. And yes, there was a financial crisis, but look at other metrics. Look at productivity growth measured as total factor productivity. I mean, that's barely measurable in tenths of percent over the past couple of years. Unemployment close to double digits compared to 7% before the crisis. And I know that I don't want to paint things with too broad a brush, but I see essentially three reasons why Europe is in its current state, and it's not a particularly happy state. The most important one, from my perspective, is clearly a lack of structural reforms in some member states. So you have European countries that are EU member states that are among the most flexible, among the best places to do business. Think of Denmark, Sweden, Estonia, UK, Ireland, and others. And you have others that are well behind. So some of these countries that are mentioned rank in the top 10 of World Bank's doing business ranking. You have Italy number 50, Greece number 61 on the same ranking. You have the same degree of variation on various measures of regulatory burden, for example, measured by the OECD's metric of product market regulation. Some of the most flexible, best functioning advanced economies and the least flexible economies in the same single market, and that is by itself a problem because regulatory heterogeneity. I mean, these massive differences are perhaps a bigger obstacle to growth in Europe than the actual absolute level of regulatory burden. I'm a huge fan of the single market, but the reality is that the single market in a huge number of important areas, most importantly services, is simply not finished. It's not anywhere near being finished. We can talk about that in the Q&A session. I would like to touch particularly on the digital issue, where I think some of the progress that's being made actually amounts to less than it seems. And then finally, Europe's problem has a cyclical component, which has to do with the common European currency. And it's absolutely correct to say that Greece's structural problems or Italy's overregulation are not caused by the euro. They simply are not. You can't blame the common currency for that. But the reality is that when you look at the experience of different groups of countries throughout the crisis, it is absolutely striking that countries that have kept floating exchange rates have done so much better than the 19 Eurozone states plus the two euro peggers. So among those 21 countries, nearly half of them have today lower GDP per capita, lower real GDP levels than in 2007, while all of the floaters, all of the countries with flexible exchange rates in Europe have higher real GDP levels than in 2007. Think of countries like Iceland, which has a major banking collapse in 2008. Or think of the authoritarian and highly indebted Hungary, which also has floating exchange rates. Those have outgrown the majority of euro countries and euro peggers. And so these three defining problems: the lack of structural reforms, the incomplete state of the single market, and the incomplete architecture of the Eurozone that has exacerbated the 2008 crisis, I think, are the defining problems of Europe today. They are here to stay, and I just don't see how it's going to get easier to address these problems in the era of Trump and Grillo and Orban. So on this somewhat pessimistic note, I'll stop, and I'm happy to expand on any of this in Q&A.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor for questions. Before I start, I see already two. I have a question for Fred to follow up on something that is said, but also I noticed that none of you mentioned one word, which is the word jobs, in your speeches, which is, I mean, in a way, the topic of this panel. And why I'm saying that? Because I think one of the negative side effects of globalization is the loss of jobs in some local communities. And this is one of the reasons why they're raising populism here and there. So my question for you, Fred, looking ahead, if you can advise for 1 minute each President-elect Trump and the European leaders on how to in a way, which kind of reforms can help in reducing these side effects, which is job losses in some communities? What you could suggest to the next administration and also to the European leaders? Just to give you numbers, in the last referendum in Italy, the largest majority that voted for no was in the south of Italy, where there are job losses.
Well, just to address the premise first, the positive effect of globalization, of course, is the creation of huge numbers of very better paying jobs. We did a comprehensive study of the impact of globalization on the United States, which showed that the U.S. economy was $1 trillion per year richer as a result of the globalization of the last 70 years. That's $10,000 per family. That's 10% or more of entire national income was a net gain from globalization. Now, against that $1 trillion of net gains, there were about $50 billion of gross losses. The costs, the downsides, the losers. So point number one is simply that the benefit-cost ratio is about 20 to 1. We did a similar study of the likely effect of TPP as negotiated. It's about the same, 18 to 1. And I think that's pretty widely agreed by people who study these things. So just to put in context your question, there are very large net gains for all of our economies from globalization, open trade, et cetera, against which, yes, then there are gross losses. To my mind, the big reason we have the backlash against globalization in the United States, to the extent it's economic, and it's not clear how much that is compared with other things, but to the extent the backlash here is economic, is because the U.S. government has done such a poor job of dealing with the costs, downsides, and losers. We have very poor safety nets to deal with the adverse effects of dynamic economic change of all types, but including trade liberalization. And we have, of course, very inadequate, even ineffective worker training, retraining, lifetime learning programs to help the actual adjustment process. So I think where the U.S. has been internally inconsistent has been its leadership of a more open, more liberal global trading system, as I mentioned before, but without ever really taking seriously the internal adjustment requirements. We had kind of a naive belief that the market would take care of it and that would be enough, or else the costs were too small to really jeopardize the overall project. But now we've seen that those chickens have come home to roost. So we have to pick up our socks. What is less clear to me is why Europe, with its much more extensive safety nets, and at least in some countries, more effective worker adjustment programs, is now facing some of the same. Again, I kind of doubt that it's due to the economics of globalization, but to the extent it is, I think that is a bit more of a mystery. But it strikes me that it's got to be more the impact of immigration, the impact of cultural issues that are now causing the backlash in Europe. But that's a question, and you may disagree with that.
Thank you. Question? Yes, please.
There's a microphone
There's
coming.
a mic, yeah. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Rashish from Transnational Strategy Group. I wanted to speak to this point about what Fred called a potential G0 economy, or what you might also look at as sort of a Wild West economy where no key economic power is setting rules and pushing back against disorder. Yes, the EU is certainly the one economic power of size that could do that, and it's true that in trade, the trade is where the EU has the strongest, what we might call sort of Hamiltonian executive powers. But I think one disadvantage the EU has compared to the US is that we have the ability, because of our institutions as a unitary state and a tradition of integrating trade policy with broader geopolitical thinking and broader strategic thinking. This seems to be a weakness in the EU, where there really isn't either institutionally doesn't exist, or there isn't a tradition of thinking as and implementing trade policy in the kind of strategic context that I think, for example, the Obama administration was trying to do it. What is the potential for the EU to strengthen these Hamiltonian powers in trade policy and to think more geopolitically and execute more geopolitically if indeed the EU is going to be called on to be the key power that's going to support a global economic order? Thank you.
David, I think you can provide an answer.
Yeah, no pressure there. Look, first of all, I mean, Fred sketches one scenario, which, you know, based on some of the sort of indices that are there, perhaps has some plausibility, but, you know, it could go the other way. And I think we have, as far as we're concerned, we have taken no view on the likely future direction of this administration on these issues. Pierre de Boissieu, who was a very famous French ambassador and Secretary General of the Council of Ministers for many years, always used to, whenever we were discussing European issues, he always liked to refer to history, and usually we'd be discussing the digital single market, and he'd say, well, I think we need to go back to the 15th century to understand the position, because he believed in the permanent interests of states. And I think the permanent interests of the United States is actually in a global order that works. So while people may be unhappy and this administration, which is a sort of disruptive politics, may wish to kind of rethink certain things, I think they're also not going to do something which is so clearly against the permanent interests of the United States. So I think I would be, I'm not saying we won't see changes in policy. This administration has been elected on a platform of change, so we are going to see changes. But I think those changes do not necessarily have to lead us in the direction that Fred has indicated. So I would hope that we can continue to have an EU-U.S. partnership in that. On the European side, I take your point. It's a very well-made point that we are a partial construction of integration. This is what our member states and our people kind of want at the moment. Some of us, myself, would like to see us go further in the federal direction. And there are ways in which we do that. We've just recently created the European Border and Coast Guard Service, which is a sort of something 2 or 3 years ago would have been unthinkable. Now we have it. So, I mean, every day new European realities are created in function of objective needs, how we better answer our citizens. On the sort of strategic bringing together of the classic, European Union instruments, trade or the single market and foreign policy, I think we're working on that. I think Federica Mogherini, the merger of the post of High Representative with Vice President of the Commission was precisely intended to do that. And I think we are moving in that direction. But it's true that institutionally we're less well equipped to connect those dots in the way a unitary state with a single president who has the executive powers that you've referred to can do. So I think we're moving in that direction. But I frankly, I don't honestly think that we would wish to fill a vacuum left by the United States, because a vacuum would be a very messy place, and we hope there will not be that vacuum, however much this administration may adjust current U.S. policies.
Question, yes.
Hi, Brett Fortnum from Inside U.S. Trade. So I'd like to talk about the snapshot on TTIP for a moment. With this new administration, obviously not seeing eye to eye with many of the views of the outgoing administration. Ambassador, what do you see as the purpose of this snapshot? And do you think that the incoming administration will feel bound by any of the progress made in TTIP so far? And in that same vein, Mr. Bergsten, do you think that you mentioned that the EU should definitely push the Trump administration toward TTIP, but what is the reason that the Trump administration would want to do that? You gave many reasons as to why that would make sense. I personally try to avoid logic and politics. I don't think they always mix. But what would give this administration a reason to do that?
I was going to defer to Dave, but okay. Well, I think there's several reasons why the Trump administration might want to go down the TTIP road. A, to show that it's not a Neanderthal reactionary force on trade in the world economy. If it does want to blow up the TPP, which it seems to do, and maybe blow up NAFTA, Chorus, and half a dozen other agreements, though we don't know yet how much is negotiating and how much is reality, but if it wants to move in those directions on those issues and faces a lot of criticism for disrupting the world economy and working against U.S. economic interests, then a natural counterpoint would be to say, but we're moving ahead on the biggest agreement of them all with the European Union. And as I said, they never opposed that. Candidate Trump never said anything negative about TTIP, nor anything positive, but he never said anything negative about TTIP, unlike all the other trade agreements, throughout the campaign. And just to reiterate, the basic reasons why people oppose trade agreements or trade with certain countries just don't apply with Europe. Low wages, low labor standards, low environmental standards. None of that applies. So if the administration wanted to demonstrate some degree of balance, diversification in its own trade approach, this is the natural. Now, the other big reason, of course, goes to the question Peter Rash has raised, is geopolitics and foreign policy. Europe is the #1 ally, will continue to be, particularly if the new administration were to raise any questions about NATO. Again, we don't know whether it's going to do any of that in practice, but if it were, but even if it weren't, I would think it would welcome an opportunity to demonstrate the positive nature of the transatlantic relationship. And again, TTIP is the natural device through which to do that. So for both those broader geostrategic reasons and the more direct, immediate economic reasons, I would think an effort to pursue TTIP, maybe on its own, but I would hope with some encouragement from the European side of the Atlantic, would be a natural.
Sorry, I don't want to, I've already answered one question, but since you addressed me directly, the purpose of the snapshot or the screenshot is simply to take stock of where we have got to after 3.5 years of negotiations. And I think that's an indispensable piece of good order on the part of Mike Froman and Cecilia Malmström. And there's a lot that is very positive in that, and frankly also relatively uncontroversial. But when you ask the question, to what extent is the incoming administration going to feel bound by it? Not in the slightest. They will have to evaluate it. Once you have a change of administration, you always have a risk of having to start again on certain issues in any trade negotiation. By the way, it would have been the same if Mrs. Clinton had won. I would not have assumed automatically that she would have said, well, whatever Mike Froman has done is fantastic, I don't need to change it. So we always knew we were going to face a new administration. We wait patiently to see, when they sort of take stock of where they're going, and we have a U.S. trade representative with whom Cecilia Malmström can engage. To Fred's point, will we push this? Look, I think our position is well known. We stand ready to continue these negotiations and to bring them to a successful conclusion. We simply do not know, in the light of everything that's been said about trade, where this new administration will stand. So we're being respectful of that, and we're not trying to sort of jumpstart something prematurely. Our position is well known. We still think the objective arguments, many of which Fred has set out, in favor of a good transatlantic deal remain valid. We would like to continue and believe that if we did re-engage next year, probably in a year or two, we could bring this to a successful conclusion. But, we are entirely in the hands of the incoming administration and what their policy would be. And I think it behoves us to show a little patience, give them the space and time to sort of figure out how they're going to manage this policy, and then we will engage and we will see where we can get to. So that I think sums up where we are.
Could I just raise one additional point? I think it's very important. New administration obviously has to come in, get its feet on the ground, decide what it wants to do, and that does need to be respected. But we have to also keep in mind the views of the Congress, which is a more continuing body, although with some changes itself, but now its leadership is maintained and it's playing a big role. What is fascinating to me is how key trade leaders in the Congress have already pushed back against the Trump statements about pulling out of TPP. I mean, Senator Hatch, the chairman of the Finance Committee, Congressman Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the two most important congressmen on trade, have said, well, now wait a minute, do we really not want to expand our economic relations with Asia? It's the most dynamic part of the world economy, biggest part, important geopolitical factors, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there hasn't been so much dialogue on TTIP because Trump has not said he's going to pull out of TTIP, but I would suspect some of the same. It's very interesting. We normally think of the executive as exercising some restraint on the protectionist leanings of the Congress. It may now be the reverse. And key congressional leaders, I think, recognize what the ambassador said, what Karan said about the way business works in the real world these days. And so it's very interesting to me, there's a pushback from the Congress against the pushback against globalization. Now, not that Congress was lining up eagerly saying, let us sign on to the TPP. That was going to be a hot debate, whoever was president. But it is, I think, fascinating. We've already seen some counteraction. And again, particularly in the case of TTIP, for the reason I said. I mean, the AFL-CIO is not going to be up there lobbying against TTIP. They may not cheer it on, although in the past they've said they were happy with U.S.-Europe free trade. I don't think they'll be up there cheering it on, but they won't be lobbying against it. There won't be any political jihad against TTIP the way there has been against TPP and other agreements. So I think that dimension has to be kept very much in mind as we think about the real world and the pragmatic realities of moving down the path that we're talking about here in the transatlantic context in particular.
Karan, in line with the pragmatism that Fred was saying, do you think it might have sense just to leave aside the idea of a comprehensive trade agreement with Europe and work on specific topics? Might it be a reasonable way to move ahead? Might have sense, or it's just damaging for you?
No, look, I'm sort of where Fred is. I think we're going to have to see sort of what the new administration comes in with, what its approach is, what its priorities and philosophy are. But look, from a business perspective, you want to see problems solved, right? You want to see barriers that exist broken down. You want to see stability, regulatory predictability, all of those. What the means is to get to that end is less, in some ways, relevant than the end itself. So now, to be honest with you, the business community has been very well served by the global trading system, by international agreements, all of that. So I'm not making light of the importance of that. And TTIP remains, I think, a priority for many in the business community. I think we'd like to see the thing come together. We'd like to see a trade agreement come together. But if that dog's not going to hunt for whatever reason, are we going to look for other ways to continue to try and enable transatlantic trade, investment, integration to continue? Absolutely, I would say. So, and look, there have been trade negotiations and trade deals that preceded, the last, spate of. So I think the short answer to your question is the business community recognizes we're in sort of in a new era here, but the fundamental interests of transatlantic companies have not changed, and we're going to continue to welcome whatever tools there are to drive those interests forward. Which, by the way, sorry to close the point, does have a relationship to jobs. I mean, to your original point about, if I didn't, I meant to correct it. I mean that we have a lot of jobs on both sides, and we're looking to grow those numbers of jobs. So I do think that there's a recognition, and to tie back into Fred's point about why Congress might care about this, I think it's because people recognize that globalization and trade do in fact generate good jobs on both sides of the border.
If I might just add, you raised basically a question about sectoral agreements or that kind of thing. The other area where, to my knowledge, the incoming president and his team have not taken any positions relates to the big plurilateral agreements that are being negotiated in and around the WTO. The Trade and Services Agreement, the Environmental Goods Agreement. I mean, these are big liberalization initiatives, which are sectoral, are not just US-EU, although US-EU, as always, are at the core of the agreements and leading in the negotiations. So that's another possibility where the U.S. and EU could work together even more closely, been working closely already, but even more closely, to try to propel forward momentum, keep the bicycle moving in the right direction, and fill some of that systemic vacuum that might otherwise exist. That's another part of the Obama legacy that passes on to the Trump administration. And on that one, as I say, I haven't heard anything from them. We don't know where they'll come out. But that's another opportunity where, again, with a little help from their friends, like you all, the Europeans, maybe the administration will stay on a constructive course.
I was just going to interject briefly because I think it's important to debunk one myth around TTIP and CETA, which is that there is this generalized backlash against these agreements in Europe, that there is this populist backlash against free trade, and therefore these agreements are doomed. In fact, when you look at opinion polls, it turns out that most Europeans are still in favor of TTIP in many countries by very wide margins. Ireland, Denmark, the Baltic states. What has happened, however, and I'm not sure if that makes me more or less optimistic, is that in two countries, in Germany and Austria, there has been a very well orchestrated propaganda and disinformation campaign organized by a small number of political groups around Die Linke and the Greens and some fragments of the SPD through organizations called Attack Germany and a protest platform Compact. So it is not a bottom-up movement against free trade which we are seeing in Europe. It's really an instance of small number of well-organized groups hijacking the discussion and also all of the reasonable people staying silent. And in fact, it's almost worse than there being a genuine populist backlash, because it shows that we as societies perhaps lack immunity against these sorts of excesses that come with the world of post-factual politics, so to speak.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes. I would say 30 seconds for a question and 1 minute for a reply, please.
Eric Coolish, American Shipper Magazine. What do you see as prospects for the U.S. And the UK to have a bilateral trade agreement now? And if, given the maybe antagonism towards multilateral deals with the Trump administration, and then if anyone wants to comment on if there's nervousness among companies after the Carrier and Boeing deals, with GE or other companies be nervous about how the unpredictability of how they might be treated?
You should answer that. Barat? I don't think you want to answer. Or you want to answer, please?
No, I look, on a bilateral deal, firstly, we don't know where the UK is heading in a Brexit context and what their relationship with the EU will be, whether they're going to leave the single market and the customs union, therefore whether they would be in the market for doing free trade deals. The only thing I can say is that even assuming they move in that trajectory, which is still an open question, it's going to be several years before there could be any meaningful engagement, because firstly they have to sort out the exit from the EU, then they have to sort out their future relationship with the EU, and they also have to sort out their relationship in the WTO. So, I mean, objectively speaking, it's going to take some time before there could be a significant and meaningful negotiation, and for that negotiation to reach a conclusion. So I certainly don't rule it out as something that could happen if you assume other things happen in many years down the road, but it's not something which can happen quickly under any scenario, in my view.
Look, I think jobs has always been a focus, right? I mean, there's been a spotlight put on it through these couple of things, but I think every company knows that that's been an issue out there and will continue to be an issue. And, if you're a company that's creating good, strong, valuable jobs here, hopefully that gets recognized. And I guess the one point to be stressed, though, is I do think we need to do a better job of explaining how in a globalized supply chain, right, when you ultimately need to be competitive globally, that is going to involve production in multiple places coming together to create the best possible product, and that's what we're seeing globally. And so that's just simply I understand it's a complicated concept, but the business community needs to do a better job of explaining it.
Well, thank you very much. It's 12:15. It's lunchtime for Anglo-Saxon standards. And let me thank all the panelists and all of you for participating today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, huge thanks to Andrea and the panel. We now have a lunch in the Paris ballroom. If you follow the members of the delegation staff, it's basically around the other side of the hotel. I would ask you to get there relatively swiftly, because we have Senator Johnson, but just for a very brief window over lunch, and we'd like to make the most of that if we can. Thank you.
It was perfect, great timing, eh?
Really good, perfect. And great discussions.